It's a joint sitting, as you know, of the two committees in finance in both houses. Apologies, are there any, Alan, any in Kulileko from each of the two committees?
Morning, Chairperson and members. From the side of Select Committee on Finance, we have only one apology from Mr. Muletsani, who's having a challenge with internet.
Yeah, he often does, that's true. Anybody else, Alan?
Good morning, everybody. From Standing Committee on Finance is Dr. Dion George.
Okay, all right. I think most of us know the procedure. What we basically do here is get a response from National Treasury to civil society stakeholders' submissions, written and oral. And all of you, I gather, except for the SAICA. SAICA's got some employee function today that did long organized, and they can't exit from that. So they won't be here, I understand, from the committee secretaries. So we excuse them, obviously. But we can send them, obviously, Alan and Kulileko, the written submissions from Treasury, which will also be a response to them. What we've suggested, Treasury, is that you have 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and then 4 minutes each for each of the stakeholders. Please stick to the time because it's a Friday and those of us in Cape Town have to make our way back to our home bases and so on. So people have got flights. So we'll be very grateful if people stick to the time. Then Treasury will respond 3 or 4 minutes submissions and we will engage with all the parties concerned. Right, then Comrade Joe, do you want to say anything? Over to you. Joe? All right, when he's connected, then he will come in. So let's hand over then to Treasury. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and morning to all the chairs and honorable members, and for this opportunity to respond to the MTBPS public hearings. I think, Chair, like you said, this has become routine in a sense, and I think precisely because it becomes a bit routine, it's important, I think, just to remind ourselves also what we're doing. So firstly, we're responding to all the submissions that have been received and the questions asked on the medium-term budget policy statement that the Minister introduced in Parliament on the 26th of October. Next slide, please. In particular, I think, Chair, we note that there were 8 submissions that were received, which I've listed on this from the Parliamentary Budget Office, the FFC, SAICA, COSATU, HILA, IEJ, Public Economy Project, the Budget Justice Coalition. So we, as you know, we pull together and consolidate all the comments received and try and respond to each of them. And so we're going to cover, Chair, 9 areas today, from clarifying government's fiscal policy and strategy. I won't go through all 9, as members can see, and we'll go through these. We've got slides, and between Edgar Sishi, who heads the budget office, and some of the other colleagues responsible for specific areas, whether it's economic policy, tax, will all respond. But Chair, let me say, in responding to these proposals, I think it is important that we just again clarify the process. I mean, the MTBPS is, in a sense, it does 2 things. It's on one hand a kind of pre-budget, which lays the basis for the budget that will be done next year, February. And secondly, it also has an in-year budget adjustment, the adjustments budget. Obviously, the adjustments budget is, in a sense, easier. It's just the immediate funding needs that we'll need till the end of the fiscal year, and to deal with shocks like the floods and other shocks to the economy after the budget that was presented in February. I think the second, but I want to just deal with what I call the pre-budget, that in terms of the consultation process, and there have been points raised about improving the budget consultation process. And let me say, we would be the first to say that, the process for consultations is never perfect and something that we're always looking to improve. And if there are specific suggestions, we would be happy to consider such proposals. Having said that, I think when the point is made very generally, it's a bit difficult to respond, in a sense that it's not clear when someone has made that point what aspect in the process that they refer to. But I wanted to point out that the MTBPS, like the budget, focuses on a 3-year allocation. And in a sense, the time to consult and respond is between now and a bit before the budget. We've had many meetings to explain to various institutions. We've been to NADLAC, and even there the questions have been asked, at what point and what form should consultations take? But I just wanted to make the point, and we'll deal with some of this specifically, that we remain open, Chair, to any thoughts. Just to make the point, though, that obviously as people make comments, sometimes there's also confusion, because we don't, for example, in MTBPS, deal with any tax measures. We just look at the fiscal framework largely, and on the expenditure side, focus on the big allocations to be made and the priorities. As you know, we have not outlined what departments will be getting specifically, even though there is a broad functional breakdowns that we provide. So, Chair, I think to make the point too that there's obviously a whole host of assumptions that we make. Again, there may be differences over the assumptions. I think that's par for the course. There's no one way of doing things or seeing the world. And certainly we are living in times of great uncertainty. And I think, as we outline in the MTBPS, as the Minister outlined, that this MTBPS is coming at a time when there's great uncertainty in the world, following what's the Russian Ukraine conflict, the impact of the floods, impact of high inflation globally, and what that's going to mean for not just emerging countries, but even for other advanced economies, given how big the US is, and also the impact, I think, of your zero COVID policies in China that has a real economic impact on all of us, and particularly when we're a small open economy like South Africa. But let me stop here. Edgar, you want to start over and just start with the fiscal strategy for this framework?
Yes, I can, through you, Chair. Thank you, Acting DG. Thank you very much, Honorable Chair, honorable members of the committees, for this opportunity. I also do want to thank many thanks to the various stakeholders and contributors who have made submissions during this process. As Acting DG was indicated, we have actually engaged with some of them even before the MTBPS was tabled in public participation arrangements that the National Treasury has spearheaded in the months leading up to the MTBPS. And so we appreciate being able to engage with them yet again, including on some of the same issues as it becomes clearer. Chair, as the Acting DG was indicating, the MTBPS provides an outline of government's medium-term policy. It does not include certain things. One of the things it does not include is policy proposals on tax, for instance. Those are always reserved for the February budget. And of course, the detailed expenditure allocations as well will be presented at that time. It's also important to indicate, Honorable Chair and honorable members, that as we have gone through this process, we have obviously kept a close eye on global developments as well as domestic risks as they begin to materialize. We consider that risks are worse and have elevated compared to what we thought at the time of the February budget, and I will not repeat what the acting DG has said. Suffice it to say, Honorable Chair and honorable members, that having looked at these different aspects, we've sought to balance between the need to ensure that service delivery, economic growth enhancing measures are prioritized, at the same time that we don't expose ourselves to negative economic outcomes due to imprudent or adventurous fiscal policies. And so balance has been very important in that regard. We do have a significant debt burden. That debt burden means that we have debts that are held by lenders and creditors in different places around the world. The market reacts, as we saw in the UK, as we saw in Sri Lanka, when you are unable to meet your obligations. And when you're unable to meet your obligations, that affects the value of your currency. It causes prices to rise, makes it difficult to purchase goods. It affects the poor more than anyone else. And it also has very significant other economic and socio-political implications when those obligations are neglected. And so what we're saying is our strategy is not exclusively focused on debt reduction, but it's balanced. It's focused on strengthening the public finances for sustainable growth and service delivery. Now, in order to ensure that that sustainable growth happens, you need sustainable public finances in order to achieve long-term intergenerational equity. You need to balance between the revenue, expenditure, and the borrowing. And of course, the financing and debt management plays a role. So what we presented at the 2022 MTBPS, Honorable Chair, as you will see in various graphs and numbers that I will show over the course of this presentation and the time allocated, and we will stick to the time allocated, is that on average, over the MTEF, government is basically splitting the revenue improvements between what I've already indicated, which is the unavoidable need to address our debt obligations. And on the other hand, the need to make injections to service delivery, economic growth enhancing measures. The specific split, Honorable Chair, is 49% to 51%. That is the exact way in which we have split this. Now, this is a split that we introduced at the time of the 2021 MTBPS. You will recall, we indicated in chapter 1 of the MTBPS, and the minister indicated as well in his speech, this particular split in recognition of the need to achieve balance and to ensure that we do no harm, as it were, into the future. Government will also be responsible in how we use these revenues. We will not rely on what we call transitory revenue gains. In other words, short-term revenue gains to fully fund permanent increases, but we will instead balance it out and use some of it to fund the need to address risks and contingent liabilities. And in this regard, Chair, we've been very, very clear in our statement. There was one of the presentations indicated that the spending numbers are implausible. The challenge there is that this ignores the fact that we've been very, very clear that permanent increases in spending will be matched by permanent increases in revenue. In other words, new revenue sources, as the minister said in his speech, must be found in order to fund permanent increases in revenue. We're not going to fund permanent increases in revenue through in spending through temporary revenue improvements. Once you take that into account, Honorable Chair, it's quite clear that government is not engaging in implausible expenditure plans if you consider that fact. And we consider that the analysis to the contrary would have to ignore what government has said in order to reach that conclusion. Now, the 2022 MTBPS also, Honorable Chair, is not austere. And we fundamentally disagree with the view that this is an austerity budget, and we will show that. But let us indicate some very high-level realities. Firstly, there are no budget reductions announced in the 2022 MTBPS for the 2023 budget. None. No further budget reductions beyond what, of course, was announced in the initial fiscal consolidation budget of 2021. In fact, on the contrary, additional spending in critical areas is made, and we will show that. Secondly, despite projections to reach the primary surplus in 2023-24, debt is still very high. We project that debt is going to be about 4.7 trillion rands this year. Now, in this regard, we have to guard against certain contradictions. On the one hand, we're told, don't move funds of the country to foreign investors and not to foreign lenders and creditors, excuse me. But on the other hand, we're told, don't worry about the deficit. Well, this is not possible. Every time you allow the deficit to rise, you have to borrow more. Every time you borrow more, interest on that debt will increase. And when interest on debt increases, you shift more of your country's resources towards foreign lenders and creditors. It's unavoidable. So you have to deal with the debt, and you have to do it in a balanced way. And that's what we've sought to do, again, by splitting the revenues between the debt obligations, which we cannot avoid, and on the other hand, making injections for service delivery. It's also important, Chair, to indicate that despite measures aimed at controlling expenditure, the funding for the social wage has been protected, and we will show that. In fact, the social wage has been very solidly protected in the budget and continues to marginally increase and has not declined anywhere whatsoever as a percentage of the overall budget. And we will show that in our slides. Chair, I don't want to go through all of these numbers, but this slide seeks to merely explain why we are pursuing the stance and the strategy that we are pursuing. And really the reason, Chair, is that we have to look back at history. We have to be aware of what's happened over the last 15 years, where South Africa's public debt has increased 7 times over. We had debt of 577 billion rands in 2007-8. Today, it's exceeded 4 trillion rands, and as I indicated, it's going to be 4.7 trillion rands by the end of the current year. The payments on the interest on this debt are now exceeding spending on essential services like health and security. And so it's important that we address that. Otherwise, we will not be able to avoid a situation in which more of the country's money, which is meant for service delivery, is actually being shifted to bondholders and creditors. We need to narrow the budget deficit for this purpose. The country's stock of debt remains high, as I've indicated. Stable public finances must underpin economic growth. In addition to the problem of debt service costs causing domestic resources to be shifted to lenders and creditors, government borrowing, if it becomes too high, can raise interest rates across the whole of the economy, making it difficult for private businesses and for households to borrow for their own needs. So it's important to control government debt and to control the interest on that debt, which is what the MTBPS does. It's also important to indicate, Chair, that we live in a global economy, as the acting DG indicated. We're highly dependent on international capital flows, and the rand is sensitive to global market conditions. If we don't address our own fiscal challenges, as I've indicated, this leads to the rand's value falling. When the rand value falls, it becomes more expensive to buy imported goods like oil. Fuel imports become high, food imports become very high, and this affects the poor more than anyone else. The fiscal strategy, therefore, supports sustainable provision of essential services to these low-income households. As that primary balance improves, the real baselines of critical public services can be strengthened. As we see the debt burden reduce, the interest on that debt can become less of a burden on the fiscus, and we can make more injections into these services for the poor and vulnerable. Chair, this illustrates how we've used the revenue. And this is an important slide because it shows two things. The first thing that it shows in the final bar is the average split between how we are addressing the deficit, which I've already indicated we can't avoid, and how we are making injections into non-interest expenditure, particularly education, health, police, and other elements that are important for service delivery and economic growth. A majority, 51%, goes to these elements, and a minority, 49%, goes to addressing the deficit. But look at the other bars, 2022-23, 2023-24, and 2024-25. We consider, Chair, that this is the impact of a successful fiscal consolidation project. You can see how, as we go along, the amount of money that we need to direct towards the deficit and towards the fiscal balance reduces over time, and the amount of money that we can put into service delivery increases over time. This is a direct result of our fiscal consolidation efforts, which have reduced the debt burden and have reduced the fiscal deficit, allowing over time a gradual increase in the amount that we can make available for non-interest expenditure additions, which provide for service delivery and growth enhancement. Again, this is not an austerity budget, and we fundamentally disagree with this view. More resources are being added in this budget to health, education, local government free basic services, infrastructure, and safety and security. There are no new spending reductions proposed in the 2022 MTBPS. And finally, one of the challenges with the analysis that was presented during the public hearings is that it would appear that some of the analysis did not take into account the fact that in the current financial year, as the acting DG was indicating, we are making substantial in-year once-off adjustments. And the analysts who presented on Tuesday and Wednesday seem to have not netted out these once-off adjustments. And as a result, they produced an analysis that seemed to suggest that non-interest expenditure is declining. Chair, when you exclude the in-year adjustments that we are making in the current year, for the floods in KZN, Eastern Cape, and Northwest, for the additional amounts required for debt service costs, and even more importantly, for the huge in-year adjustments that we are proposing for Sunrail, Transnet, and for Denel. If you net those out, the budget grows in line with inflation over the 2023 MTEF. Let's look at the medium-term spending plan. The 2023-24 financial year is the final year of the fiscal consolidation that was announced in the 2020 MTBPS. The current MTBPS, as I said, again and again, does not include any new budget reductions. And indeed, from 2024-25 onwards, main budget non-interest expenditure grows above inflation. Main budget non-interest expenditure is increased next year by 52.5 billion rands. In the following year, it is increased by 58.5 billion rands, all of them compared to the 2022 budget. These additions are split the following way. Over the MTF, 66.9 billion rands is added to health, education, and provision of free basic services by local government, as well as the one-year extension for the COVID-19 social relief of distress grant. 8.9 billion rands is added for safety and security. This is on top of the 8.7 billion rands that was added, Honorable Chair, at the time of the 2022 budget. 11.3 billion rands is added for infrastructure investment, including the rehabilitation of damaged municipal infrastructure and the refurbishment of provincial roads. As I've indicated, the social wage is protected. It increases from 1.13 trillion rands this year to 1.2 trillion rands in 2025-26. Spending on capital assets, in other words, infrastructure investment, grows at an average of 15.2% over the next 3 years, mainly due to the additional funding, as indicated, for infrastructure investment in municipalities and provinces. And this is the fastest growing item of the budget. Let's take a closer look at the social wage. The graphs that are indicated on the left-hand side explain the point that I was making earlier. If you look at the social wage, which is in the red bar as a percentage of overall consolidated non-interest spending, at no stage do we reduce the social wage. The only anomaly is the fact that the extension of the social relief of distress grant happens over a one-year period in 2023-24. And this once-off extension obviously has an impact in the percentages. But up to this point, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, we've consistently maintained and protected the social wage as illustrated here in these graphs. The social wage, just for clarity, includes services to the poor and the most vulnerable. As indicated, the components in the bottom are housing, local government in terms of local free basic services and electricity and water, basic education, social security, public transport, various employment programs, fee-free higher education and training, water services, in other words, services provided to those who can't pay for them, health and social protection. Let's look at the social assistance provided by government in South Africa compared to other countries. This is not our data. Let me indicate that as a disclaimer. This is a combination of data, mostly World Bank data, that compares countries around the world to each other, developing countries, not the advanced, richer economies, but developing countries and emerging market economies of which we are a part. And as you can see, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members, South Africa compares well with public spending on social assistance programs. Of course, it is a valid argument that we could do more and we need to look at opportunities to do more. But as we move towards that thinking, we also have to have a perspective about where we are compared to other countries in the world. And we consider that that is also a very important part of thinking about some of these areas of spending. Chair, I want to shift then to issues related to growth without necessarily going to all of the details, particularly given the time, given the fact that a number of the contributions that were made are related to the issue of growth. We consider, as we've said before, that the problems of growth in South Africa are structural and long run in nature. South Africa's growth is limited by structural challenges related to the ability to combine capital and labor in a dynamic and integrated way that would drive sustainable long-term growth. And this is reflected by the fact that it's not just the annual growth levels that are low, but the potential growth of the economy has been low for some time, averaging below 2% over the last period following the global financial crisis. This low potential growth is what limits the scope for demand stimulation, which is an issue raised in particular by the Parliamentary Budget Office over a number of cycles. To us, this suggests that it is unlikely that additional spending will stimulate growth without increasing inflation further in the current environment of low trend growth, high inflation, and high debt levels. So the gap between growth outcomes that we see on a quarterly and annual basis and the potential growth, which is what we're talking about here, is expected to narrow significantly over the medium term, right? One of the things that's important in this regard is addressing the impediments to growth, including the low electricity supply. And this is part of the three elements that are required to combine to put the economy on a higher and more sustainable growth trajectory. The three are, firstly, you need a clear and stable macroeconomic framework because this lays the foundation for a growing economy. Sound macroeconomic policies provide critical buffers against external shocks. Chair, this is illustrated to some extent by events that have taken place over the last 15 years. If we compare where South Africa was in 2007, 2008, versus where we were at the time of the start of the COVID crisis, in other words, the two crises that have happened over the last 15 years. We had the global financial crisis in 2008, and we had the COVID crisis in 2020. At the time of the 2008 global financial crisis, the fiscus was fairly strong. South Africa had good buffers, and we were able to weather that storm quite well. In 2020, we were hit by the crisis of COVID, like other countries around the world, but our fiscal position was much weaker, and as a result, we found ourselves with a deepening burden. Secondly, low and stable inflation and a more sustainable fiscal trajectory reduce uncertainty, lower borrowing costs across the economy as indicated, which anchors return expectations for investors and increases business confidence. All of this is necessary to boost productivity. This is the first element. The second element is rapid implementation of economic reforms, which is required to boost economic growth. These include addressing the structural weaknesses of the economy. A big part of our structural weakness at the moment is the fact that our electricity supply is so poor. Load shedding is wreaking havoc on our growth prospects, and this needs to be addressed. And we appreciate that everybody accepts this. And this was made quite clear in the public hearings. And I think that that's something that is broadly agreed across the board. And it's something we, of course, recognize. In addition to that, Chair, we also need to address high levels of market concentration, where competition is very poor, which leads, among other things, to higher prices. Excessive red tape is a major challenge as well, and this also needs to be addressed. In general, the high cost of doing business in South Africa has the potential, among these others, to limit the rate at which the economy can grow and create jobs, which ultimately is what we all want to achieve. Making progress on structural reforms in the agenda outlined by the President in 2020 and in 2021 is critical. And Operation Vulindlela is making some differences in this regard. And since the 2022 budget, some progress has been made. And the presentation that we made both at MTBPS and the day after and Parliament outlined the specific progress that's been made. And so I won't repeat it here for the sake of time. And finally, the third pillar that we consider as important to put the economy in a higher and more sustainable growth path is addressing the enabling environment and the capacity of the state. This includes the overarching regulatory environment, which includes the provision of critical public goods and services that are supportive of inclusive and sustainable growth. One of the things we're referring to here, Chair, is the need to address the high levels of crime which affect economic growth in the country. The state must boost its capacity to prioritize, to sequence and coordinate interventions through adaptable policymaking and institutions that are capable and accountable with the ability to make choices where trade-offs arise. For this reason, over the next 3 years, the spending increases include support for economic growth, the delivery of health, education, and local free basic services, as well as injections for the police and other law enforcement institutions of the state to fight corruption and crime. Chair, I'm not going to go through all this, except to say that one of the points that was raised by the Parliamentary Budget Office related to investment and gross fixed capital formation and the implications in this regard to growth. Chair, what we're saying here essentially is that as far as the forecast, which the Parliamentary Budget Office raised as a concern, what we have done is, when we look at the forecast average that is embedded in the MTBPS, it's not significantly out of line with the long-term historical averages that have been there in the past. And so we haven't done anything, in our view, in the forecast that is somehow out of line or is in any way not justifiable by these long-term trends. And so if you look at the long-term historical averages as indicated on the left-hand side, they're not significantly out of line with what we are forecasting when we take into account some of the impediments that we have indicated, including lower electricity supply. The other challenge, Chair, that we have observed is, although there are different views, and we appreciate the different views on the ability of increases in government spending to stimulate economic growth, we consider that it's also important to look at the history. And in this regard, the history of fiscal stimulus is quite mixed. If you look at the graph reflected here, it shows growth in non-interest expenditure of government in real terms, in the bars, the orange bars, and the growth of the economy, GDP growth in real terms, in the black line. And as you can see, in the different years since 2006, 2007, it's not always necessarily the case that by simply increasing government spending, this will lead to higher economic growth. To us, Chair, this suggests that prioritizing spending and improving its quality is actually more important than talking about simply adding more money to the budget. And in this regard, fiscal policy should focus on quality rather than the quantity of spending. Chair, let me turn to the issue of revenue and the revenue estimates. Various commentators have suggested the revenue forecasts are too optimistic, but we want to point out several things while being aware of the fact that there are risks. First, there have been strong collections again this year. This is in large part due to higher corporate income tax. So even though we announced the reduction in the corporate tax rate in the last budget, corporate tax income in rand terms, corporate income tax revenues in rand terms, which is the physical money that you need, has actually increased. But this time, the improvements are not just in mining, they're also in the finance sector and manufacturing. And this is very important. Secondly, the fuel levy relief and elevated VAT refunds in 2022-23 have not significantly reduced what we're taking in. They mask the high in-year revenue across most major tax categories. Also, Chair, the MTBPS revenue estimates do align with the baseline macroeconomic projections. There were questions around this on Wednesday. So higher inflation has indeed led to higher tax bases and nominal GDP, improving expected revenues. And this is reflected in the numbers. But the in-year reduction in the real growth is taken into account in our revenue estimates. Chair, over the MTBPS medium-term estimates, the tax elasticity assumptions that were reflected in the 2022 budget are broadly maintained. In other words, we have not tried to cook the revenue books by increasing the elasticity assumptions in any way whatsoever. A majority of the assumed revenue gains from high commodity prices are also excluded from the corporate income tax forecasts from 2023-24 onwards. And this is also a point that was asked during the hearings. We are assuming no additional revenue measures in terms of new tax increases beyond those proposed in the 2022 budget. Chair, and this is something that COSATU also mentioned during their contribution, and we fully agree. SARS is clearly improving its performance, and the rebuilding of SARS is evident in the improved revenue collection that we are seeing in the fiscal framework. Additional revenue gains from SARS efficiency improvements represent an upside risk to the estimates over the medium term. And indeed, we considered that the proposed additions to the budget of SARS from the 2022 budget, where we proposed an additional 3 billion rands, are important in this regard. However, we do accept and acknowledge what commentators and various stakeholders have said, which is that there are significant downside risks to the estimates, and these arise from what happens to the economy. The global economy is in a dangerous position. However, estimates are for some marginal growth in the global economy. Should a global recession materialize, however, this would certainly imply that we would have to revise down our revenue estimates. So we fully accept that there are significant downside risks to our own estimates, but we are taking into account what we have in the estimates at the moment, notwithstanding the risks that this could change. As indicated, the MTBPS did not include announcements on tax policy, as these are generally made in the February budget. There were various comments that were made in this regard. These include that there should be an increase in taxes for those earning more, that taxes on luxury imports should be raised, and that the corporate tax rate decrease should be reversed. Secondly, that government should introduce a net wealth tax and reduce medical tax credits and retirement fund deductions, and impose a new resource rent tax. Third, the taxes on fuel should be reduced to lower the cost for households. And finally, to improve revenue collections, SARS should be provided with additional funding. Chair, these proposals will be considered for the 2022 budget. After assessing them, as well as the state of the economy, the fiscal position, and the required expenditure commitments. There was a statement made during the hearings from HELA about a request for a response on issues around the health promotion levy increase. Chair, we felt even though feedback has been provided directly, to put it on the record that although there was a delay, and we apologized for this delay, National Treasury did in fact respond to HELA on the 26th of October, 2022. Although the response may not have been satisfactory, it is not quite the case that we've not responded, we did respond. And we indicated that the records that they're looking for are not there because we in fact did not have the formal meetings that they were indicating we had with the sugar industry. Finally, Chair, there were comments that South Africa should not go above the 25% tax to GDP ratio, or at least that's how we interpreted it from SAICA. Our response is that there is no government policy stating that the tax to GDP ratio cannot go above 25%. And indeed, in different countries around the world, the percentages are different. Chair, there were questions around the credibility of the spending ceiling. And let me summarize our view here by saying that the spending ceiling has been in place for now nearly a decade. We admit that the effectiveness of the spending ceiling has been limited. And this is why we announced in the February budget 2022 that we're working on various measures to try and improve the effectiveness of our fiscal anchors. There were questions around spending risks that are not allocated in the 2022 MTBPS. And among them was the Eskom debt takeover. And in this regard, Chair, we were very clear in the MTBPS that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, although progress is very good, and we will include these as they materialize. And of course, we aim to make a very specific announcements in this regard, including on the quantum in February. There were questions around the public sector wage bill. Of course, it's difficult with the public sector wage bill because we respect the bargaining, the collective bargaining process. And because of that, we are not going to preempt negotiations. And as negotiations would take place for 2023, we would defer to those negotiations before we do anything. There were statements about the unallocated reserve and about what this is for. Our position, Chair, is that these funds are not earmarked for anything at this time. Chair, we also made the point around the social relief of distress. This is a point that's not new. We first made it in the MTBPS last year, that a permanent extension of the SRD, because at the moment we've only got it for 1 year, but any permanent increase or any replacement thereof, whether it's a basic income grant or whatever you call it, needs to be matched by corresponding permanent increases in revenue, and we maintain that position. There were issues around the findings of spending reviews and zero-based budgeting. Chair, what we're doing in respect of zero-based budgeting is we are using the outcomes of spending reviews in order to consider and analyze budget baselines. Pure zero-based budgeting is difficult to do and requires a lot of resources that we don't have. But we are taking some of the principles of zero-based budgeting when we do spending reviews. And the outcomes of these will determine baseline analyses that will be done in future budgets. While it is regrettable that some policy decisions with financial implications have not been finalized, the inclusion of reserves is meant to protect the integrity of the overall fiscal framework. So our friends at VETS raised this as an issue of credibility. What we're saying here is that we are taking steps to protect the credibility of the fiscal framework in a context in which there are decisions that have not been made yet. We obviously would prefer for those decisions to have been finalized, but we have no choice but to take into account the fact that we're still waiting for those things to be done. Chair, I'm not going to go through all of this because these are known facts about the public sector wage bill and the uncertainty, and colleagues can read them because they are, for all intents and purposes, public in nature. Chair, this slide repeats what we said.
Edgar, can I just draw your attention? You've got about 6 minutes left and you're slightly over 50% of the slides, but I'll leave it to you to manage the remaining time. You can always come back when you're replying to the stakeholders. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. No, thanks, Chair. Thank you very much for that. So, Chair, I'm
Well,
not
allow
going
some latitude. I mean, you know, a few minutes is not bad. But then the NGOs will complain that they stuck to 4 minutes. So let's be fair.
Sure.
Because you got lots of documentation. You addressed the House last week through the Minister. You addressed the committee last Thursday. And you've got a big chunk of time here. So let's be fair, Edgar. But you're doing very well so far in explaining things. Whether we agree or not, that's another issue, honestly. Okay, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair, for that. Chair, I'm not going to go through this because this slide, I've already dealt with this issue. And this is, for all intents and purposes, a repeat, as you indicated, of what we said last week to the committees around the debt issues. Chair, with respect to SOCs, there are various issues and there were various questions around SOCs. A lot of them were centered around Eskom. Colleagues can answer questions later on, of course, but let me just indicate the fact that the plan that government is implementing here is to basically address the long-term financial viability of Eskom and to help Eskom be in a better position to implement planned capital investment and critical maintenance in order to improve the electricity supply. And so we considered that it is a good policy decision to take. The market has responded positively to it in respect of, if you look at the impact on the yields on Eskom bonds. And of course, we have been clear that we will announce further details in the February budget in this regard. There are various conditions to the proposed special appropriation to state-owned enterprises. I'm not going to read through all of them. They were discussed during the SCOA hearings this week, but for the purposes of the record, they are listed here in the slide. There were also other issues that were raised, Chair. Colleagues will address them in more detail. These include on grey listing. There are various steps that we're taking to avoid grey listing. We do not agree that it is inevitable that grey listing will happen. Hence, we are taking steps to avoid it, including through legislation that is proposed, as well as the proposal for additional resources to be provided to critical functions that deal with money laundering, as well as investigating and prosecuting corruption. In particular, the Financial Intelligence Center, the National Prosecuting Authority, the police, and of course, the Special Investigating Unit is proposed to receive funding, which will be clarified in greater detail in the February budget. There were questions around climate change. And here, as we indicated, Chair, in the MTBPS, fiscal policy will continue playing its part in providing economic, or rather shifting economic incentives towards cleaner forms of energy, including in respect of the taxation policies that we adopt. Chair, as I draw towards a close, let me indicate that on the issue of public participation, which was raised by some, and also there were, I would call it, indirect statements around whether or not we are being open and being consultative in our approach to the budget. Chair, I think as we indicated, South Africa remains among the top 2 countries with the most transparent budget process. And as the acting DG indicated, we've got a variety of efforts that we have attempted to implement in order to improve public participation, and colleagues can read them there. So we think we've actually got a very strong public participation process, but of course we are very much open to any suggestions at more inclusive public participation mechanisms. Chair, let me conclude. As we indicated, the MTBPS does not announce new tax policy measures, for example, or the detailed expenditure. This will be done in February. Secondly, the fiscal strategy, contrary to some of the statements that were made, is not exclusively focused on debt reduction, but is balanced. Thirdly, in order to ensure sustainable public finances, to achieve long-term intergenerational equity, we need to be balanced between the revenue, expenditure, and borrowing, and this is what we're attempting to do. Fourth, stable public finances are by themselves important for economic growth. Fifth, government is allocating funds to reduce fiscal and economic risks posed by Denel, Sunral, and Transnet. And we plan to take over a portion of Eskom's debt, and the details will be announced in February in this regard. 6, government continues to assess trends in employment and compensation across the public sector to ensure that there is sufficient capacity and a fair, equitable, and sustainable remuneration policy. We indicated this is quite clearly in Annexure B of the MTBPS. Government is addressing deficiencies identified by FATF to avoid grey listing. And finally, the National Treasury is open to more inclusive public participation mechanisms. Chair, I will stop there and hand back to the acting DG
Chair.
and yourself.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, Chair, so let me
Sorry,
just,
Momo, just a quick thing. I'm sorry, I apologize. I got it wrong, actually. It's not 45 minutes, it's 50 minutes you have. So you have up to 9:55, but let's not be mechanical. If you can finish in the next 5 minutes, it'll be great.
no, Chair, we'll finish in the next minute, so.
Oh, all right. The
we'll-
others are not
we'll
going
do
to take
that.
the other slides. The other slides are not going to be considered then.
Yeah,
you're
no,
just
no,
taking them for our, yeah, okay,
Yeah,
fine.
so,
Sorry about
yeah, so Chair, just as Edgar concluded, I mean, I think to repeat again, I think we always are looking at how to improve the public participation and the budget process. So we're always open to those ideas. The more concrete, the better. Let me say that on the FATF FIC story, certainly by February, by the budget, we will know whether we're going to be grey listed or not. So I'm hopeful that it actually coincides with the budget period, but we'd be able to have a good sense of whether we're going to be grey listed or not. So hopefully we'll have good news by then. And although I think the actual meeting will be a day after the budget, on the normal budget date we have. I know the dates are not set yet, but that's what I anticipate. But Chair, can I make the last point that certainly, you know, the team has had many roadshows with investors, and we've had many queries, for example, obviously on Eskom's debt. And what we explain is we've got to talk to bondholders, and hence, you know, we couldn't provide the kind of detail. But yesterday, for example, we issued 2 statements, I think, just to clarify, both on the Eskom debt, and the ministry issued a statement, and the department also issued a statement on Sanral, on how the process on the GFIP debt, how it's going to be shared, and the fact that we're working towards an MOU with Gauteng. I'll stop there, Chair. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Momo. Can we then move on to the next section, which is each of these stakeholders gets 5 minutes. Kosatu, in the order that you're there, obviously the chartered accountants are not here, but go ahead, please.
Okay. No, thanks, Chairperson. Yeah,
Okay.
good morning, Chair. Good morning, comrades, members, colleagues from Treasury. So, no, I just want to thank the response by Treasury. Look, I think we do agree with government that we can't afford a runaway debt scenario, because you look at international experience that leads countries to go into the IMF, and then you do have a very brutal austerity regime that will come into effect. So we want to avoid the Greek route and many routes that other African countries have experienced, because we think that will threaten all the gains we have won since 1994. But having said that, Chair, I think where we disagree with our colleagues in Treasury is that we do feel that their focus is to reduce the debt, to reduce expenditure to departments, and a huge chunk of that is by simply giving public servants either no increase or a below inflation increase. We think the real approach, Chair, is to plug the holes in government, reduce the money we lose to corruption, wasteful expenditure, to rebuild Eskom and Transnet and other SOEs and municipalities to stimulate the economy. We think that's a more sustainable approach towards just simply cutting. Otherwise, we think we're just simply kicking the can down the road. So while we say that we think government is sort of brutal austerity approach, as you have with the IMF, but we think there is the components of austerity. Because if you look at most of your public service departments, the frontline departments, over the MTEF period, virtually all of the increases over the MTEF period are far below inflation, very far below inflation, barely at half the level. If you look at the increases for social grants over the MTEF period, again, far below inflation. And of course, government awareness and why, but in terms of recording purposes, projects a cutting of the SOD grant in 2024. So those we think is elements of austerity cuts because it's below inflation. Chair, we think also that we are being a little bit disingenuous, to be honest, to say there's no elements of austerity when we didn't get public service increase in 2020. So 0%, yet inflation was there. Last year, we gave them below inflation increase, and this year, government is offering a 3% increase, and that's barely half of inflation. We have seen the headcount of the police service decrease from over 200,000 a decade ago to about 172,000 today. And even the increase we're projecting for additional SAPS hires this year of 12,000 barely keeps up with about 10,000 attrition rate. We've seen similar declines in headcount ratios in other key departments. The MTPS does make a commitment to reversing that, but there's no practical details. Chair, I think for us also, we're talking about growing the economy, but yet we see the amounts of money we're giving to the Department of Trade and Industries, industrialization, export incentive programs, also getting below inflation or real term cuts. We don't see a real kind of measures to significantly reduce unemployment. We had hoped to see the presidential promise stimulus being increased because it has done quite well to help 500,000 young people get into the labor market. But Chair, I think also, we think there are some positive elements too. You know, the support given to Transnet, the commitment to reduce the ESCOM debt, etc. But we are worried that the support given to Transnet is not going to make a difference if we don't give them the security, law enforcement support. We are quite surprised when there's not additional support given to Metro Rail, which is struggling quite severely. There is a positive 40 billion rand allocation to local government, but we're not spelling out what exactly is the plan to arrest the complete slide in municipalities. You know, 90% on severe financial distress. We're very worried about rumors that ESCOM's debt will be conditioned upon its selling off its assets, its productive assets. Chair, I think if you really want to see how can we increase revenue, then let's give more resources and support to SARS, which has really done wonders to begin to increase revenues, tackle tax evasion. We think we can do more if we intervene in the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, which has about 5,000 mining rights applications backlogs, to take advantage of the commodities boom, give more support to Transnet as well. Chair, we really had hoped that government would have kept to its commitment in April this year and in September 2018 to review the fuel price regime. We think there is space on the 32% taxes that are charged on the fuel price to give some relief to commuters and to the economy. And we do hope that Treasury can help to lobby in Cabinet the Department of Transport to bring the RAF and the RABS bills to Parliament to begin to put the RAF on a sustainable trajectory. Just coming to the end, Chair. The Minister made good commitments about corruption, but we didn't see practical measures in the MTBS. And if you look at the NPA's performance around its annual performance targets in the MTBS, it's barely at 15% of its targets having been met. Again, if you look at other departments' targets, and we can come to the appropriation hearings, many of them are very, very far behind. Yet these are critical departments to the infrastructure program. And we are quite worried about how far behind we are on the infrastructure program. So I think, Chair, we do appreciate there are contradictions, but we do think that given the severity of the economic crisis, of unemployment, of corruption, etc., government, not just Treasury, but government as a collective, needs to do far, far more if we're going to turn things around. We can't just simply continue to do business as usual and then hope for mercies on the side. But yeah, I think let me stop there, Chair, and hope I stuck to the time frames.
Thank you. And then we've got the IEJ next. We'll include the PBO. They want to comment. They can have their 4 minutes too. So let's go for IEJ. You here, are you? Institute of Economic Justice, are you here? Nkululeko, Ellen, are they here? No.
I don't see their representative, Chairperson, in the platform.
Public Economy Project. I saw Rashad, I think, on the screen names.
Yes, Chairperson. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can indeed.
Thank you, Chairperson. And firstly, we'd like to thank National Treasury for its responses, detailed and considered. Our input doesn't question the technical capabilities of the Treasury officials, which we believe still remains excellent, but the political failures of Cabinet overall, and that manifests itself in what we see in the MTBPS today. So thanks for the clarity on revenue projections, specifically noting that short-term increases arising from commodity prices don't affect the baseline beyond what is considered to be the return to the median of commodity prices. And this is something we've noted, and it happened to this country in the 2000s, where we considered short-term to be long-term and to be trend growth. So thanks for that. On the implausibility of the spending path informing the MTBPS, would like to reiterate that the MTBPS is there to provide a credible picture of the long-term public finances, so over the medium term and beyond that. We note in our presentation, and we clear about this, that macro factors are exogenous to government, a lot of them are, and indeed any deviation from this is perfectly understandable and par for the course. However, when it comes to excluding material expenditure pressures, and Edgar noted this, it means that the expenditure path informing the MTBPS is implausible, right? So with regards to ESCOM, and this is an overall government inability or failure to make a decision. Similarly, when it comes to the SDR and the presidential employment stimulus, as well as, and again, this is, and Edgar noted this, wage negotiations are again, exogenous to government, but the spending path put in over here may not manifest, and that's where we consider to be implausible. And this overall suggests that the political center of government, the cabinet, is divided about key policy issues, and that then manifests itself in budget planning and the quality of public deliberation on fiscal choices, and this is then weakened. So with those points, we'd like to again thank Treasury for its responses and thank the committee, the joint sitting of the finance committees, for giving us the opportunity to make these inputs. Thank you very much, Chairperson. Over to you.
Thank you, Rashad. Public Economy Projects done. Then we've got BJC, Budget Justice Coalition. Are they here in Kululeko, Alex?
I don't see their rep either, Chairperson.
They have obviously been invited, right?
All of them, Chairperson, we've invited them.
Oh, it's unusual that, you know, so many of them, of the 6, are not here. All right, then we go to Healthy Living Alliance. Are they here?
Yes, Chairperson, there is Eunice.
Yes.
Oh, good morning, Chairperson and fellow honorable members. Thank you to
Eunice,
Treasury for...
To Eunice as a chair, right? So you have to be Eunice Junior to be fair, right? I'm twice your age.
Okay, Eunice
So
Junior from Gila.
And I'm Eunice Senior. Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct.
Now you're going to have 20 minutes. You have 20 minutes since you agree.
Good morning, Chair and honorable members.
We can always say young Eunice. We can always say young Eunice and old Eunice. So.
That's also fine.
Out of order. She's agreed already. Don't interfere.
Good morning, honorable members, and thank you so much to Treasury for responding to our submission, which we had on Wednesday. What as I was listening to you, just listening to the rising cost of borrowing, it just even more contradictory to me as to why the decision to delay the increase of the health promotion levy, because I mean, even in that we could have increased some fiscus, and I mean the projected decrease in NCDs is the projected decrease in health service costs, which would be great for. That means that then more money could be used for other things such as education and other crippling services that are falling apart. And just also to respond specifically to the statement made by Treasury that they responded to our request on the 26th of October, indicating that there were no records of the meeting taken. I am unclear as to how and when and to whom they responded, because I was personally the liaison person with Treasury and we have not received any phone call or email, even just because the last email I received, if I may just read the exact, sorry, it said that there was a delay in finalizing the requested information as they had been struggling to gather information from the relevant business units that deals with such matters. However, they had finally responded and a drafted response was sent to the legal services for review before being able to be signed off by the information officer on the response. And they had promised to respond by no later than the 10th of October. So we had anticipated that the response would come in the same form as an email or the like. So unfortunately, we find that response not to be satisfactory because we don't know exactly how it came, to whom received, because even none of our colleagues have received the response. Thank you.
Acting DG, can we just settle this matter, please, offline? Can we get a letter from Eunice within a week and from yourself, DG, as the head, right? What's going on here? Have you sent a reply or not? Do you really want a PAIA application over what should be open and transparent? Right? And in fact, our friend there, Matthew, explained, which I understood was likely to be consideration. The committee hasn't taken any position whether the delay is warranted or not. It probably is warranted, I don't know. But why don't you apply and sort it out offline then? You want to really detain us. Can you give that commitment? You want to say something, DG?
No, Chair, I'm going to send the letter again. A letter was sent. I'm not sure why they haven't received it. And look, we have a good relationship with HELA. And
yeah, so I gather.
So let me assure Eunice that you know the reason why there was no input on meetings. We did not have meetings with the sugar lobby on the other side. Yes, they did write and protest about or express their concerns about the increase and how they felt that it was not in line with the master plan, the sugar master plan. We encountered other legal issues that made it difficult for us to do so. But we're happy to talk to HELA again. I'm going to try and trace the letter even whilst we have this meeting to send it to Eunice right now. And we'll try and understand. We'll go offline to see why they didn't receive it.
Yeah, no, I take your word for it. I know your attitude to HELA. But just to alert new members and HELA, Eunice, I'm not sure whether you were there in the processing of the first amendments. The committee at that time, well, both committees, Health and Finance, supported National Treasury's proposals. We wanted something slightly more, but we also had to, of course, take account of a lot of things. I think we sent this out on Tuesday. Just to remind new members, we had to take into account the consequences for workers, emerging farmers, established farmers, and a whole lot of other things. And we had to do a trade-off and balance things out. We may not have succeeded in the way HELA wants, or in fact in the way COSATU and FAWU wants, and other unions, but that's what we came to. So I know that Treasury is very empathetic with HELA. So I think it is a understandable glitch, Eunice, and it will be sorted out. And if it's not, you have access, you can find my cell number. We've got it. It's in the public domain. It's 0825530174. Since I'm chairing that now, I'll take responsibility on behalf of the two chairs, and I'll keep the co-chair in the loop, if that's okay. Now let's move on to Healthy Living Alliance, please. Oh, we're done Healthy Living. Sorry, what am I doing? Okay, then we're done. Surprisingly, very quickly. Tracy is going to demand now half an hour, and they'll be right to say. Sorry,
forgetting PBO.
Oh yes, PBO. I keep
Honorable
forgetting. Can we do this? Can we do this? Look, we always forget PBO because somehow we think you're inside and we see you often. Maybe you're going to say not often enough. I know, but look, Alan, Tabo, and Nkululeko, please in future put them down as they don't belong like as a stakeholder in that sense, civil society stakeholder. They might see themselves like that, but they're not. So you have a separate item and say PBO the same time. And then if there's more time, well, we give you a bit more time because really we've saved time, but then others didn't use their full time either. So you can take about 6-7 minutes at the most, please. I know you guys run 25, but please. Okay, thank you. Because the members will get tired of listening and they want to engage, obviously. Thank you.
No, thank you, Honourable Chair. We do want the members to have time to respond, and so I'll try and be short. I also want to apologise on behalf of our director who's been called to another meeting that he can't avoid, and so he's asked me and others from PBO to respond. So in order to be brief, Honourable Chair and Honourable members, I think what we're seeing coming from the responses from National Treasury is a presentation of views where they seem to be quibbling with definitions and not taking into account the seriousness of different definitions and the underlying economic, philosophical, ideological perspectives that go with that. So when we're talking about austerity, you know, you can repeat 50, 60 times, well, this is not an austere budget and we can show it. But there are definitions of austerity that show that after prolonged periods of fiscal consolidation that lead to an outcome where you have higher unemployment in the economy, that is a definition of austerity. And that's a definition that prominent members, for instance, of the OBR use, the Office for Budget Responsibility in the UK. So we need to seriously think about not only the definitions, but the impacts of fiscal consolidation. To talk about a stimulus, when you're simply talking about a nominal increase in government spending in a particular year, is also playing with definitions. I think COSATU, I won't repeat what COSATU said, but they spoke about the impacts of inflation on so many spending areas and what the PBO has done and what we'll do also in our presentation on the Division of Revenue Bill and the impacts of there is look at real per capita spending and the changes. And so that brings us to the talking about and how you define protecting the social wage and ostensibly protecting the people of South Africa who we've seen have faced increasing unemployment, worse poverty for working people, more precariousness in employment, a weaker economic structure, and lower resilience and decreasing food security and health in response to ongoing crisis and future severe crisis. And so when we're talking about stability, and this also then leads us to what stability of the fiscal policy framework, to ignore resilience within the economy and then also about how to restructure the economy in a way that you're actually supporting a more inclusive and equitable growth is a problem. And so we note the Treasury's responses to the PBO, but we want to say that they're actually not answering the questions that we're asking. And this seems to be a problem that I've seen over a number of years, not only in response to us, but also in response to others. And so we are talking past each other. And in the past, the members have said maybe there should be a session where there's a debate between Treasury and PBO, but I don't think that is the way to go. I think what members of Parliament, particularly the Finance Committee, when talking about the fiscal policy framework, needs to do is to actually get experts to talk about different approaches to economics, economic theory, and the ideological underpinnings, and how you interpret the South African economy and the fiscal policy framework within that context. Otherwise, we're going to keep talking past each other and quibbling. The one other point I wanted to respond to was the issue of gross fixed capital formation and the use of the average. In 2018, I presented on the MTBPS and compared what was forecast in budgets, what was estimated in MTBPSs, and in actual outcomes over the medium-term period before that. And we showed exactly the same thing. I think what we're seeing, and as I said when we did our MTBPS presentation, is that I worry that even this approach of looking at the average over a long period of time when is wishful thinking, and that we need to actually, especially when we pin our hopes on GDP growth coming from investment, to be much more realistic. And there are other ways to look at investment and what's driving investment. And maybe that would then also get people in Treasury to start thinking about the real structural constraints in the economy, how the economy is dominated by a few corporations, etc., and the role that plays, and why then increase, if there are increases in the years when there have been increases in fiscal expenditure on infrastructure, that hasn't turned into economic growth. And in fact, in periods when we've had high economic growth, we've had high unemployment, and that is part of the reason we need that structural transformation, but we also need that structural transformation to be supported by increased social spending. And so the issue of the social wage and what's claimed to be protected is not how much and what percentages get spent on it, but the actual levels and the backlog. And have you dealt with the backlog? And it seems like the backlog is getting worse, and that goes for infrastructure as well. And we're seeing now what's claimed to be investment and capital expenditure being maintenance of infrastructure, or at least part of it. I've got one final point before I stop, and if there is time, maybe somebody else from PBO wants to come in. My last point is going to be on public participation, and everybody, well, at least National Treasury and to some extent maybe members of committees, point to transparency and South Africa's high ratings. Now, the first point is I've looked at these things over a number of years. Everybody gets rated fairly poorly. So transparency isn't necessarily the best measure, especially the way in which it's done in those surveys. Secondly, it doesn't take into account the structural problems, which mean that poor people who are not organized and who don't have the resources are less able to get involved in these processes. And so their voices aren't adequately heard. And so we see roadshows, the banks and bondholders and other things, but the poor and the unorganized are out there. And perhaps that's something that Parliament should be looking at. What efforts can be made to go into communities to help them to organize, to resource them so that they can more fruitfully participate in these public participation programs. The other thing is that it brings me back to this question about different approaches to economics and philosophical thinking and ideologies. If we keep speaking past each other,
rounding up, please.
It's
almost at 8 minutes.
Yeah, this is my last point. It's easy to talk about transparency, but we're actually not making ground on changing each other's minds and having a proper debate. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right, over to members. Whose hands are up? In Kuleko, Alan, I don't see any. Oh, yes, there's Dennis. Yeah, is anybody else? Dennis, Willie?
I see there is a member from BJC, Chairperson
Oh,
Elroy.
yeah, okay. Can we take the Elroy first? Elroy, can you come in, please, man? We asked for you to come in and it seemed you were not connected at the time. So Elroy, can you go ahead, please?
Thank you very much, Chairperson.
You've got 4 minutes, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you can hear
4
me.
to 5, yeah, you can have up to 5, yeah, fine.
Thank you. So, yes, just for the record, there was no communication to myself or to my knowledge to BJC, but let's leave that as a mistake.
No, we shouldn't. Yeah, we shouldn't leave that. Look, we have very good secretaries, I must say. So it was definitely, you're very important. Some glitch that happened, you can discuss it offline and avoid that. But the norm has been.
Let me just say we're not going to read any more into that.
Yeah. The norm has been to function like this. You come back on the Friday. Okay, go ahead. Sorry about that. We apologize.
No problem. So just on a quick response, I think what Siraj has spoken about, we concur with fully. We have done analysis where we compare votes in terms of real and nominal changes. Most of it has been cuts, Honorable Chair and Honorable Members. And the next thing that we are going to do, let me just at least speak as one of the members, AIDC, we will have to raise awareness and deeper insights to social movements and trade unions about why is the economic growth constrained? What are the implications of debt? What is the scale and impact of budgetary cuts? We began to do that, but we want to go deeper. Where's the money coming from? And where should the money have gone? And in not apportioning the money to where we think it should have gone, where are the multipliers and what has been lost in terms of multipliers? So thank you for considering us. We thought procedure-wise that there would be further responses, but we will be happy to engage moving forward. Thank you.
Okay, Elroy, you're free to come in later, I'm sure, because you got more time than we anticipated. All right, over then to members. Dennis, you were first, then Willie, and there was a third person. Who's the third person? Fani. Okay, go for it, guys.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, well done, Treasury. Quite emphatic this morning. I just felt that there were a couple of things that were raised the other day that were perhaps not addressed, and perhaps Treasury can come back to us as they respond to this round and just detail them. So firstly, let's deal with in the order that they were up front. So COSATU, again, the wage bill and the risks on the wage bill side. I'm not sure that Treasury has dealt with the responses that we would like to see in terms of the risk of the increased wage bill. And I realize it's obviously it's under negotiation and under discussion, and it's quite difficult to apply any sort of a quantum. But perhaps Treasury can tell us, for each percentage point increase in terms of the wage settlement, what is the fiscal impact of that? It would be most useful. I do think as well that, and COSATU also touched on e-tolls, the e-toll debacle continues because there's quite clearly a total lack of understanding. Now, there was an initial celebration that e-tolls are gone. There was then a realization that, hold on a second, e-tolls, there's still got to be some sort of a funding model in place, and e-tolls are probably not gone. It's just the management of them that's going to shift to Gauteng, and maybe we'll get a bit of a discount on it. Now, we've had the Premier from Gauteng telling us that they will be raising their share of their funds through consultation. And yeah, if anyone knows how to do that, please, they must let me know, because I'd love to raise that kind of money through consultation. And then, of course, we had the declaratory or the clarifying statement from Treasury yesterday saying, hold on, guys, e-tolls are still in place until such time as there's an alternative solution. So I just wanted to maybe emphasize that and ask, is there a proper model behind this thing, or is this just been well, we have to make a decision, so let's announce a decision and then we'll work the details out later. SAICA had two very good recommendations. One was talking about a risk-based guarantee schedule, which I thought was very useful and something constructive that we can start looking to the future. I think that that would be nice to answer. And then, of course, the other comment about stripping out the repair and maintenance side of infrastructure spend and separating it from the new infrastructure spend, which I think is also important in terms of the fact that we're looking towards, again, infrastructure-led recovery, etc. Chair, my last comment is the PBO. I just wonder where the line is drawn between the PBO being an advisory entity versus them pushing a specific ideology. But I suppose that's for us to interpret and decide how much we want to value their inputs. Thank you.
Next is Willie. Willie, I have to inform you that you've only got 1 minute for being rude about me. And the coach, I discussed it with, don't laugh, I discussed it with the co-chair, and he's a very complacent, relaxed, composed, dignified, diplomatic chair, unlike me, okay? But even he agrees, you can't get more than a minute. And already I've consumed 30 seconds of your time.
You see, Chair, we've got an old saying, if the shoe fits. I say that we can call one the old Eunice and one the young Eunice.
Right.
I did not say which one we can call one.
You're not a lawyer. Go ahead.
But it seems to me that you fitted the shoe of the old Eunice. Thank you, Chair. No harm or pun intended there. Chair, yeah, thank you. A lot has been said in the replies as well as in the presentations that were made about the fuel levy. I have touched on that and people gave commentary on that. We also heard what Mr. Chris Axelson said, that it is time for the fuel levy to be reviewed. I would just like to find out, will there be timeframes? What is the situation with the fuel levy? If we look at where we are standing with the exchange rate between the rand and the dollar, things are looking very bleak. It is going to increase. The oil price, with the instability that we see currently worldwide, will also increase. And it will have a huge effect on what South Africans on ground level will experience with regards to cost of living. everything that we eat, everything that we consume gets transported by trucks in South Africa. We've got a railroad that's depleted, so most of that is going on transport on the road. And I think a review of the fuel levy is of extreme importance in order to lower the cost that each South African, especially the poorest of the poor across the border, are paying for food. And I think it's important that we get to a point where we get maybe timelines or the ideas that they are coming up with. I gave one idea and one point, and that is the road accident fund. But I think we also need to look at deregulating the industry. We must do everything in our power to see how we can lower the fuel levy without damaging the fiscus. There must be a balance, and I think it's high time that we really investigate that. Apart from that, I'm covered. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thanks. Can we have Fani, please?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I'm going to go straight to page 3 or slide 3 of the presentation, where it says that government will not rely on transitionary revenue gains to fund permanent spending increases, but will instead use these funds to reduce some of the risks and the contingent liabilities. Now, I want to know if Treasury took into account the fact that the mining sector and the agricultural sector performed quite well the past 3 years, but they are currently under tremendous strain, as Honourable Oukamp indicated now with regards to the diesel as one of the factors. And then I'm going to take it further. We all know what happened the past 2 weeks with regards to negotiations in Russia and the effects that the fertilizer or expected fertilizer shortage will have in the South African economy. And that goes down to the end user at the end of the day. I think input costs will go through the roof, and that will definitely have an impact on spending measures and the amount of funds that is being spent in households. And when we go to the mining sector, it's obvious that the mining sector in South Africa it's not doing so well at this stage. And we all are aware of the fact that one of the mining groups are focusing in establishing itself in Australia with regards to copper mining on that side. What do you guys think will happen in the next year? How will this impact on the economy? And obviously, do you think that the amount of tax that will be collected by SARS will stay constant? Or do you expect that it will definitely decline in the next few months? Thank you, Chair.
We would like more hands, but otherwise the 2 chairs will come in. Also, to be fair to the committee secretaries, Elroy, it was sent to you at the same time it was sent to everybody yesterday at 12:04. So I think something went wrong, on some cyberspace, and maybe you didn't pick it up, but the committee secretaries are reporting to the committee that they did send it. So having said that, let's see if there are any more hands before the chairs come in. In that case, co-chairperson Maswangani wants to come in. Thank you. Joe?
Thanks very much, Eunice, chairperson. And let's also welcome the response from Treasury and the inputs by colleagues. FFC and PBO raised very critical issues so that they don't fall through the cracks. FFC made an observation that this issue of ever raising repo rates, we don't see how it is assisting ordinary people, because it's just about restoring financial credibility. So you are just only defending the rand on the expense of people who are holding bonds with the banks. And what FFC says that this issue of ever raising repo rates and interest rates is elevating domestic inflation, and rising interest rates may exacerbate existing social inequalities and create vulnerabilities. As we speak, Chairperson, there are many people who are losing their houses, which are being repossessed, losing their cars, and so on. I'm not sure whether we are aware about that, because seated here as public representatives, we should be aware of what is affecting the people that were leading. Can I be convinced that this strategy of ever raising interest rate is in the best interest of the country, or is in the best interest of the rand, defending the rand, but causing problems? You see, COSATU has raised the issue of wage negotiations. Once you increase the interest rate, it goes into eroding the wage of the teachers, the nurses. If you are participating in the housing sector, for instance, you will realize that teachers, nurses, police are beginning to be part of what we call a missing middle. Missing middle in the sense that it is becoming very difficult for them to get money directly from the market to purchase a house. Therefore, NHFC and others have to intervene. At the end, people end up without properties that they own. They end up renting, and so there's a serious, this thing has got serious impact. So you can't blame COSATU when it raises issues of wages, unless you don't have brothers who are civil servants. Even ourselves as public representatives, people out there think we earn a lot as parliamentarians. It's not like that. Most of the money that we earn goes into what we call allowances. At the end, you take 60% cash home. So I think Treasury, we understand the independence of the board. I wonder, what do you call it? Reserve Bank, and it can take decisions, but it takes decisions on whose expense. I think this is a matter, Comrade Chair, that we have to take forward and really be convinced, because we are living in this country and we see how people are affected by the ever-increasing interest rates. And when workers goes to the street, protest, we think they are unreasonable. They are not. It is because of the situation where they find themselves in. And they don't only service the bonds and the car loans. They have to take kids to school and all over. They are defaulting throughout. And if you look at the amount of people who are going to Bomachonisa, it's scary. So it's a matter that we have to discuss. And I'm not convinced that all over the world, every time there's an inflation problem, the solution is to increase the repo rate and the interest rates. There is a matter that FFC, I think, will have to come back and give us more clarity. When they analyze the problem of the SOCs, they spoke about establishing an SOC governance framework. I'm not sure if they are here in the platform, as PBO is here. I will be interested in understanding how this SOC governance framework can be applied in order to stabilize SOCs. If you remember, not so long, an SOC like Transnet never had a problem of liquidity. It was one of the best performing. But now there's money that Eskom also has to be bailed out. What went wrong? What are the reasons? Eskom was cash flush. It was doing so well. I remember very well, I was in that sector of transport at some stage. But what went wrong? Is it the problem of management? Is it the problem of governance? And so on and so on. And also FFC raised the issue that there has to be an urgent finalization of a new funding framework for higher education and training and local government fiscal framework. We'll be interested in these recommendations, because If PBO and FFC come here, give us recommendations, and we don't follow through, I mean, it's like we're not taking them serious. And these are critical statutory bodies that are assisting us to analyze budget. So they should give us the meat of what is it that they are proposing. Probably it can go a long way in stabilizing the budget. And the same applies to PBO. The PBO says that there are multiple additional sources of revenue that could increase the government's revenue base that should be thoroughly explored. Dr. Siraj, I think, give us the details. Which are those sources of revenue which should be explored, and then we're able to put that in our report to Parliament. Lastly, Chairperson, I just want to find out, does government have a willingness to reduce the debt? Because as we are seated here, somebody just sent me a statement. I will send it to you now, Chairperson. This statement says it is from the World Bank Board of Executive. It was issued today from Washington. It says that the World Bank approves $497 million in financing to lower South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions and support just transition. It talks about commodity commission. Why borrow these monies to deal with the just transition? Not so long, I think 2 weeks or so ago, we were with the minister who said there was an under expenditure of almost 28 or so billion. But seated here, you are going to Washington to borrow money. Now here, we are busy talking about reducing the debt. You are borrowing money to deal with just transition. And when the debt is just skyrocketing and is going to threaten the sovereignty of the country and is going to be a problem to generations to come. So what can we get it? Momo, you are here, you are the DG. What is this money for? Or is this letter that I have a hoax? If it's a hoax, just dismiss it. I will send it to you right now so that you respond while we're here. Because I just got it now when we started the meeting. The issue of debt is very, very serious to us who are living and to the unborn. We can't be public representatives and leave problems to the unborn. What type of people are we? That is not sustainable development. So I'm asking a simple question. Is government have a willingness to reduce the debt, or it is interest to have all these debt problems? If not, why are they keeping on borrowing when they have to reprioritize within the budget and fund this thing called just transition and decommissioning power stations? Thanks very much, Chairperson.
Thank you, Chair. Unless there's anybody else, I'll come in now quickly. Okay, you can come in after I speak anyway. It's not a problem if you want to raise anything, please. So firstly, I think the issues the co-chair has raised need to be addressed, obviously. Maybe Treasury, I should say that, look, because you bring the budget to Parliament, you in a way, in our eyes, take responsibility for government as a whole, not just Treasury, right? Obviously, we all understand that there are many other departments that have roles to play, and you can do very little about it except nudge them, but you can't force them. You don't have the authority to do what they're supposed to do. So, you know, I personally would hate to be a senior official of National Treasury, right? Especially in a time like this. So at the personal level, I think, you know, we can be empathetic with the positions that you find yourself in. But obviously, we don't represent Parliament as a whole any more than you represent the Cabinet as a whole. But we have to air these things so that when you engage with the various departments in the processes of shaping a budget, these issues are filtered into the discussion. So, you know, I just want to say, you know, I don't know how to put it diplomatically. But my coach is now getting much more, let's say, strident rather than being diplomatic, as he often is compared to me anyway. I think, anyway, that's my view. Obviously, all right, let me put it like this. What is it that you're saying that's new? What is it when you talk about the structural constraints on the economy and the structural reform that's necessary that is new? It's the same old, right? Now, one concedes there's been some progress, but nowhere, absolutely nowhere near the progress that's needed. Nor is there any glimmer of hope that it will necessarily improve dramatically. It's the same old things. The 5 or 6 things you referred to. There's been some movement on the spectrum, true, but how much else? There has been. You speak of the Volondele project. It's happening, but nowhere near the pace we need. And obviously there are global circumstances that are very bleak. We can't hold you simply responsible for that. But many of the choices we make are not shaped, actually. There's a broad context, it's global, but the rest is our decision making. And the choices we make are not simply dictated by the bleak and adverse global circumstances. Maybe it's an unfair question to ask, but I wanted to know about the commodity boom. How durable do you think it is? I mean, it's very hard for you to predict, but we're riding on the back of that, right? And the last time it slid, and it slid very fast. I mean, we really went down in revenue. But I think it's true that what Kosato says and what we've been saying in our committee reports, that SARS overall, for all its weaknesses, is doing well. And it needs more support from yourselves as Treasury financially, because unlike other SOEs, the returns are very much clearer. The more they have, the more capacity they have, the more funds they have for that capacity and more resources they have, the more money they're bringing in. And there's a correlation between the two. You know that better than we do. Then on the reliability metrics, you address that, but a lot of commentators are raising issues around the fiscal risks, those who appeared here, and they speak about the lack of reliability of the metrics, as Rashad and them say. Then on the issue of fiscal policy contributing indirectly to stimulating the economy. Now, obviously, we know that fiscal policy alone cannot ensure growth, right? It's the quality of spending that contributes towards that. But how do you respond to those who argue that actually we need a fiscal policy for growth? And this fiscal policy seemed largely revolving around debt. And yet, as the co-chair says, we're accumulating more and more debt in dollars this time. It's not about growth. And yet the ANC's position is we need a fiscal policy for growth. And the majority party provides the framework for the government's budget. It doesn't dictate every little, no capacity to do it, and it shouldn't, but that's the broad framework. Then on the issue of, I agree with PBO, the squibbling on definitions. I also think that this issue about austerity that he raises, I'm a bit more guarded about what I say because I'm not sufficiently confident. But there's a lot of things that the PBO says, which I don't think Treasury takes seriously. And as our committee, we've encouraged you to engage with each other and come back to us. We were also committed to doing something, and we must look into what we offered. The secretaries must come back to the chairs and we must deliver on what we said we would do. On the BIG, it's an appropriations ultimate decision, but we have, as fiscal framework reports, you'll see, said that we ask the appropriations to look further. It is about allocating money, but we agree with the need for a BIG. Now, once again, Momo, Edgar, and others here, please, we're not some populists, really. Of course, we understand the very limited fiscal space. But we've said repeatedly, and we don't get the replies, really, that are adequate. We've said, of course, we understand the fiscal space is very limited. Of course, we know the economy is not growing in it. Of course, we understand the background of COVID and, the July unrest and the floods in KZN and everywhere else. And only yesterday, there were further floods. Now, we're not naive. We're not romantic populists. But you know as well as us that if we don't do something for precisely the reasons that you've been referring to, the crisis we're facing globally and here, we're going to have a social explosion. You think the July unrest, as you well know, those issues are simmering. That was related to a particular aspect of it was related to a particular problem in the ANC that the whole world knows about, right? The former president's incarceration and so on. We can agree or disagree and all on whether it's right or wrong, but that contributed. But ultimately, it's a structural issue. In a country like ours, with its extreme inequalities that are mostly racialized, though there are also remarkable numbers of increasingly of poor white so-called coloreds and Indians too. All you got there is a mainly racialized, and that's why it's more explosive than in other countries. So what we got here in July last year is only a foretaste of what's to come. Just how, with bleak economic growth prospects, with no jobs, in fact, jobs being lost every now and then and being regained, I don't know what the overall figure amounts to, but how are we going to prevent that without some sort of basic income grant? A measured incremental process has to begin. We can't hobble from one year to the other. Of course, you're much more technically sophisticated than we politicians are. And you can, though, have some sense of how long this commodity boom might endure, in some broad sense. Obviously, you can't plan simply on, excuse me. But we have to look forward, Momo and your team, and the minister. I don't think the Appropriations Committee are going to give up on the BIG unless they decide to change the report this year around. But it's going to happen. And civil society, we've said, we said, don't bank only on us as politicians. You must come to the party by putting enormous pressure on the state. But we have to do more. So on the BIG, I really don't think you're going to escape that, really. And you have no choice, really. It's a matter of measuring how much, when, and so on. Unless you can provide a phenomenal projection of growth rates and jobs, more particularly. And then finally, on public participation, yeah, I agree with you more that people shouldn't just say there's not enough public participation. Come with proposals and you will think of it as well. I do think there's more public participation that is made out by civil society, even if less than there should be, given that we all need to work together like never before. So having said all of that, I'm not expecting a point-by-point reply to everything. It's part of a discourse and so on. The issue really is what we put in our report, and more importantly, what we act on in what we put in our report on the fiscal framework for adoption on Tuesday. DG, I'm not expecting full answers to all of that, but pointed replies are fine. And obviously, the main thing is to reply also to the NGOs that are here, and they mean well. And we must encourage them also. Momo, we are worried about the credibility of Parliament, okay, and you should be too. Look at the decreasing number of people that participate. We're in a situation of enormous financial and economic challenges, but how many people make submissions? 8, 10, right? And how many people even appear? And even fewer come now in the replies. They may have their reasons, but if our credibility goes down further, we will be partly responsible for it. You too will suffer as the government. Thank you. Are there any other hands? No. Yeah. Okay, Gigi, over to you and your team.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just acting DG. Okay. No, thank you.
DG. Yeah, we know. Okay, right. We all know you're acting DG, and we all know you're 85 years old, and and you'll be moving on soon. So fine. Okay, don't get technical. I'll deal with the issues.
And for the record, you're 1 year older than me. Thank you, Chair.
Okay.
No, Chair, look, I think, the questions raised are all legitimate questions in the sense that, there's no one way of doing things. And the budget certainly reflects the choices made by government, obviously the priorities that are to be funded. And, there's no doubt that there's many ways to deal with the budget, depending on what you prioritize, and even if you agree on prioritization, what you would allocate to departments and so on. I guess the difficulty we have, and having been in a budget before, in 2008 when we were running a surplus, we had a lot of fiscal space. And in a sense, a lot of that fiscal space then was used over the next few years. We've had mediocre growth since, say, 2010, and it has reduced our fiscal space considerably. Now, there are many different, and even in economics, it's not a pure science, but of course, there are views. And for example, with the Parliamentary Budget Office, the views expressed, it's a different framework. So when it's Mr. Mohammed says that the problems, the consultation process doesn't get to perhaps what he wants us to do, I think we differ, that just spending our way is not going to lead to more growth by itself. I also think that, and you know, we don't say this to shift the problem, but I think the biggest problem that we face currently is the capability of the state, and is the fact that, you know, we can allocate money, but it doesn't mean that therefore we get good results. In fact, we get very poor results for the money that's allocated. Even the points made by Kusatu, you know, if you look at the budget for police, if the headcount numbers are down, it may not be because they didn't have money on the budget. So that's talking the past year. It's that for some reason, they're not attracting, or people are leaving faster. I mean, to get into the actual reasons, we've got to go to each of those departments and check. It's not really, I would contend, because of a lack of funds. That doesn't mean that they don't need more funds. But the challenge we have is, if we do provide more funds, it's not going to be spent. And given that by its nature on any budget, even if you were a very rich country, the demands to spend always exceed revenue. And that's why to the Chair Scoff raising the issue on debt. Of course, countries run debt, and ideally, you want to run debt that's largely, you can say, in line with what we spend on capital. If you look at our budget, we're just not allocating enough to infrastructure. In fact, and Edgar can come in, if you take social grants and the remuneration budget, it totals $1 trillion. It's a huge amount that we allocate. We tend to squeeze out funds for infrastructure and maintenance, funds that are growth enhancing. And yes, the issue of the SOEs taking money, they've almost become like a fourth sphere of government wanting their share of the equitable share. And if you don't fund some of them, you know, we got to take a view that either some of them need to be closed down if you don't want to fund them, or you fund them so little that they become like zombie companies. They can't really do much. And that's the difficulty we face. And hence the special appropriation is there to say, we've got to get Transnet functioning again. It's not functioning anywhere near where it should. We're not exporting. If you look at some of the calculations, players have come, they said we could have exported 50 billion Rand more, and hence got 20 billion Rand more in revenue, roughly, okay? That's just from the Minerals Council. So these constraints are having a very direct impact on our growth. I think Edgar's pointed out that the biggest problem we have, of course, is Eskom. And the constant load shedding is having an enormous impact, both on growth, on many small businesses, on employment, and we've got to solve those problems. So, you know, unfortunately, we don't have a shortage of problems. And when it comes to some of the state-owned entities, you know, hard decisions need to be made. And make no mistake, for every Rand that we give to an SOE, it's 1 Rand less to a key function in health or education and so on. So, yes, the budget is about trade-offs. We don't have much fiscal space. And because we borrow more, in fact, our deficits have been relatively high at 4-5%. Our debt to GDP is increasing. If you remember in 2017, when Minister Gigaba announced the MTBPS, the markets reacted very negatively. It was, in a sense, a smaller form of the response that you've seen with the UK budget when their Chancellor Kwarteng came and did a mini budget. They got a huge reaction. And in fact, when we went to the IMF World Bank meetings, I think there was a lot of shock and awe that even an advanced economy like the UK could have got the kind of response. And for the UK gilt market, which is almost like an anchor, that they got the kind of reaction that they did. So I think certainly the lesson we also learn is that when there's such times of uncertainty, on the one hand, there's greater pressure to be fiscally more prudent. And if you want to stabilize debt, and bear in mind, we still run budget deficits, the debt is still increasing, even if we stabilize the debt to GDP ratio. And if you don't spend towards growth enhancing expenditure, it may yet prove to be not as sustainable as we would like to think. So I think making those hard choices is difficult. And yes, Chair, when you raise the issue of the BIG and so on, I think all we're saying is that if you're going to have a permanent increase in expenditure, especially when it's a form of non-capital expenditure, recurrent expenditure, whether it's grants or for remuneration, you got to then increase the tax. And the tax that we're looking at, if an SRD, you're looking at 40-50 billion rands net ballpark. And if you make the amount higher, our estimates could be 80-90 billion. And it could even be 130-140 billion rands. Those require, I mean, if it's 50 billion, it requires, it's equivalent to a 2% VAT or 2% on personal income tax. No other tax can give you that kind of money. And not any, you can't rely on extra revenue collections that come for such spending. So those are the challenges, and we face the choices we face. And yes, it's good that we're having a vibrant discussion on the choices we're making. And many of the submissions, as I say, have a different economic outlook. And yes, it's unlikely we're going to agree. And there may be that frustration, but I guess in those instances, they have to look at, if that's the political choice they want to exercise, then I guess they have to win and win on the political side to have those policies. I mean, bear in mind that as the other countries have high inflation, yes, they are going to raise interest rates. That does have an impact on our inflation and hence our monetary policy. And of course, the SARB is independent when it comes to setting interest rates, and would argue quite strongly, and we'd agree with them, that if they weren't to increase interest rates when you got higher inflation, the outcome would be far worse. If you look at a country like Turkey, where the president intervened, and obviously there was a lot of pressure to lower interest rates, they're now sitting with a form of hyperinflation, and we don't want to get there. I think you certainly won't have growth then, and I think that's an outcome you want to avoid. So we are operating in a constrained environment, and yes, trade-offs have been made. And Chair, I want to say these trade-offs are approved by cabinet. The MTBPS goes through cabinet. There's discussion. Yes, there's different perspectives. Many on the spending side would want to get more money for their function or for other functions. But one comes to some sort of consensus about how to move forward. And that's the approach. Chair, I think even the debate of just casting the budget as austere or austerity, it's not just an issue of differing on definitions, but what the alternative that's been put forward by the PBO, I would contend, is not something that we accept. And we don't think that they've put up a strong enough case to argue that they can deal with all the other risks that we face. On the one hand, yes, how the markets react is important, but more importantly, I don't think they really touch on the issues of if there are more funds, function by function, will they be spent well? And a lot of that is a function of what happened during the state capture years, how state capability was weakened. And yes, we are recovering, but also the global environment. And yes, the SOEs may also, some of them clearly be, could be mismanaged. And do we have the right people running those entities? So all of those factors come in, but it's again then up to the board of an entity to decide why we're having more load shedding than we've ever been used to. And to what extent is management the problem? To what extent is the structural issues, the fact that we've got old plants and we're not getting new capacity, maybe the challenge. I mean, those are the hard decisions that need to be made. Chair, on the issue of the World Bank loan, that's, I don't know if our ALM colleagues are here, but those are, no loans are secret. We always state both in the budget and in the MTBPS, the extent to which, say, we make domestic and foreign loans, and to what extent we're trying to get concessional lending. So those are catered for. There's the World Bank loan that you see has long been negotiated. I saw it this morning. I don't think it's not a fake statement. It's genuine, and it's just a culmination of a process that was started with the World Bank. Recall that we took out a loan last year, and we're continuing across that track. I think Duncan is not here, but our colleagues from ALM can provide the numbers. The minister had also talked about, on the just transition, the two loans that we've got from I think KfW and I forget the French entity, but one of the colleagues can come. I just don't have it on my tongue at the moment. I think, Chair, just on some of the other issues, like obviously the cost of living issue is critical. And it's, in fact, one of the reasons why the SRD grant has been extended for another year, to try and compensate households for the effects. But yes, we're not going to compensate many households for the tough times that we face, to the extent that the burden should be on the fuel levy. You can lower the fuel levy, but then you've got to increase some other tax to get the revenue to maintain the spending levels. So in a sense, it would help if anyone who says, let's lower the fuel levy, also provides an alternative, because it does leave a funding gap. And the one thing we have to do in a budget is to show that we've got a credible funding policy as well, and not just a spending limits. But let me ask just the team to come in. I think there were many questions that were asked. We may not be able to deal with all of them, and we're happy, Chair, to provide some of those responses perhaps in writing. We could try that. But Edgar, do you want to kick off?
A moment before you go on, just very quickly, if you are providing it in writing, some of it needs to be inserted into the report, right? To be fair to you and to be fair to the NGOs and to Parliament. So if you can let us have it, if possible. I mean, you've got a team there and you can do it while you're sleeping. Can't we have it by Sunday so that the staff, say by Sunday noon, so the staff can insert some of it into the report? Some of it you may need more time, but some of it at least by noon. You're looking hesitant.
Okay, Sunday is going to be tough, but we'll try, Chair.
Please,
till Monday morning at least we could.
All right, Monday morning then. Okay, 9 o'clock Monday morning, because they have to submit the report. While I'm at it, colleagues, we will get the report as usual by, let's say, 4 or 5 p.m. it gets to the chairs, then we obviously look at the observations and recommendations mainly, and we go through the whole report. And then we'll let you have it by 5 p.m. on Monday. And we're voting on Tuesday, and I think it's in the houses respectively on Wednesday. But okay, fine, let's go on. Who's next?
Edgar?
Yeah, thanks, Mama. Thanks, Chair. Yeah, through you, Chair. Very, very quickly, because the questions on revenue, particularly fuel levy, prospects for the collection on the mining side, I believe Chris Axelson can answer those. And then if Poipuso wants to come in on the issue of on the monetary side, to the extent that it is in our domain, she can do that as well. Of course, the rest on monetary policy, the committee engages with the Reserve Bank from time to time, and they can provide more color. Chair, I think let me start at the end and just say that we agree with what you are saying. I mean, on the social protection side, as far as the basic income grant is concerned, that it is a political decision, and it's not a Treasury decision per se. It's a decision of government, and it is a political decision. And so we very much respect that, and we very much understand that, and we accept it. And internally, in our own conversations as a Treasury, that's how we treat it. And we take guidance from Cabinet on what to do. And it really was Cabinet also that gave us guidance and supported the one-year extension. I think going forward, all we've tried to do, Chair and honorable members, is we've tried to give thoughts and parameters around how we think about it, because the conversation on these things, as Acting DG was saying, and our humble opinion in this regard is that the political conversation as well, Chair, needs to center around not just what we want to do, but also what the trade-offs are, because everything has trade-offs. So on things like the basic income grant, there are trade-offs in respect of what that means for the taxes you'd have to raise, and who must pay those taxes, and what the impact would be on the economy and investment. Because even if you say we're going to tax rich people, that's fine, but you've got to understand how much you think you can get from it, and B, what the impact in terms of the decisions that they make to try and avoid that tax. I'm not saying evade, but avoid that tax, what those could likely be. There's no one sitting in this meeting does not react in some way when a tax is raised on you. You try and do something to try and reduce that burden on yourself. And so we should expect that, and we should try and think about what that would mean when we say we're going to try and fund something. We've also tried to communicate to political leadership the situation at the moment in respect of grants, Chair. We've indicated at last year's MTBPS that 46% of people in South Africa are already on social grants. We've also indicated that if you're going to do permanent expenditure increases, you have to fund it through permanent revenue, so that when the decision is made, notwithstanding that the decision is a political decision and it's a government-wide decision, we must understand what the trade-offs are to that decision. What we're proposing, Chair, is we are saying that we need to see a higher level of investment to improve economic growth and job creation, particularly in areas which have a very high, what we call employment multiplier. In other words, where the likelihood of creating jobs is very high. Agriculture, construction industry, for example. So if you look at our proposal in respect of increasing the budgets of infrastructure investment, whether it's in roads or water or building bridges, etc., this is about creating jobs in the construction industry and absorbing people into employment. Now, the challenge there, as has been raised by various people, the Parliamentary Budget Office has made a similar point, and we agree with that point, is that it's not just about putting money into those things, even though we are recommending more money into them. It's about how the money is spent. It's about the quality of the spending. It's about the quality of the institutions that must implement the projects. So the focus, we believe, needs to shift from the money and whether or not you're adding to budgets or not adding to budgets, which is what we call incrementalism. In other words, where the conversation is just about, adding more money. Is this growing or not growing? This conversation is it doesn't go to the heart of the real issue. The real issue is, what is the performance? What's actually happening? And what are the departments and the entities able to actually achieve? And what are the capacity challenges, which Momo referred to, that are there? I think if we pay more attention to these, and the Treasury is not exempt, of course, from this. The Treasury plays a big role in it. In some areas, we have been poor. If I think about, for instance, on the procurement side, the fact that we have had a vacancy in the procurement office for a number of years has, I think, negatively affected our ability to monitor some of these things. And it's good news that we have now appointed a chief procurement officer. It's late. It's been 5 years since we had a permanent chief procurement officer, but now we have one, and we can start moving forward. So this is part of it. And the last thing, Chair, I just want to cover before maybe allowing some of my colleagues to come in, is on the issue of questions around the wage pressures and the wages. It's a complicated conversation because, to Honorable Ryder's point, the wage system in South Africa, in other words, the remuneration system, is composed not just of the salaries, but it's also composed of a variety of benefits and a variety of allowances and so on and so forth that are under discussion, and reforms are being looked at in that regard. There was a summit between government and organized labor earlier this year to try and thrash out some of these things, and we're looking forward to more engagements of the same, which the Minister of Finance has publicly indicated he's very committed to. But it's quite a complex issue, and there's a review currently underway that is being led by the Department of Public Service and Administration to try and rationalize some of these things. Another thing that we need to rationalize is the fact that we currently have hundreds of public entities that are not government departments, but they are part of the overall state apparatus. And in many cases, they receive transfers from the budget approved in the appropriation by Parliament. And these entities currently hire about 160,000 people. There's 160,000 people who don't fall under the, in many cases, the rules of the kind of public sector remuneration framework and the coordinated bargaining system. So we need to deal with that, particularly given the fact that in a number of cases, quite a number of these people working in these entities are paid very large salaries that exceed the standards that are in government departments. CEOs of some of these entities earn more than the DGs of departments, and in some cases earn more than the president. This is an area that COSATU and other unions and ourselves as the Treasury are in very strong agreement needs to be addressed, because it is not sustainable, and it's in fact not acceptable that we should have this situation. So, Honorable Ryder, I'm not answering the specific technical point that you are raising about the fiscal implication, but what I'm trying to illustrate is that it's a very complex system, and we have to deal with that, with the aspects of the system that are causing us a lot of problems. And we are running a process at the moment to address things like, the 160,000 people working in public entities who are being paid much more than what you see in the rest of government. And as I said, in this regard, we fully agree with unions that this is an unacceptable situation, and a process is underway to deal with it. Chair, let me stop there and just allow other colleagues who'd like to come in, particularly on things like the fuel levy, revenue, as well as on the macro questions that were asked, including on inflation and interest rates. Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, who's next?
It might be me, Chair. Thank you,
Yes,
Chair.
yes.
Good morning, honourable members. I think there were just a couple of questions from our side. On the fuel levy, what is the situation? What are the timelines? So part of this is for the DMRE and part of this is for us. As Momo was saying, in terms of the fuel levy and any decreases, we then really need to see, well, what do we need to adjust in order to make up that lost revenue? Does it require additions in taxes elsewhere? Would it require reprioritization? How does it fit in with our fiscal framework? So a lot of those taxes and the tax component of the fuel levy, we would really need to see how we could fill that gap if we were to reduce it. So that is under consideration, and that is obviously what we look at when we do the budget each year. There are other elements of the fuel price which we have been trying to make progress on. A lot of those are the responsibility of the DMRE, but they have already, for example, published a gazette to try and deregulate the price of 93 unleaded petrol for inland areas. For example, this would have a cap, so it would allow service stations to compete and hopefully reduce those prices. That is in the process of consultation after those draft gazettes, and that could hopefully go ahead. We have reduced some other levies as part of this. There was the demand side management levy that we removed. The big thing, I think, was COSATU, who've also put forward that the road accident benefit scheme bill really should try to get moving again, and hopefully that can reduce the liabilities of the road accident fund. But it is something we're working on. We haven't put forward strict timelines, so I think we must go away and think about those. The other was on the impact of the global recession on tax revenue, and will revenues decline? At the moment, what we have in there in the book is sort of our best estimate of what we think will happen with revenues going forward. We've been under forecasting quite a lot in the last few budgets, especially on corporate income taxes, because we keep thinking that this commodity price boom would just fall away immediately. Now we're assuming it will go forward for a couple of years and most of it will fall away, but that some of it will still remain. I think that has been a lot of the contention with analysts, that we've sort of changed that view slightly compared to previous budgets. But we have been under forecasting quite dramatically in the previous budgets. So how durable will this commodity price boom be? It's very difficult to tell. It would be great to know, but it looks as if a lot of those pressures to keep the prices up have been sustained, and they might well be sustained, especially if you look at the geopolitical circumstances that are happening, which is also very difficult to predict in terms of which way that will go. There's also lots of differences within the commodity. So we got a lot of revenue from iron ore, but now iron ore prices are down quite dramatically. Platinum, palladium, rhodium are still quite high, especially in rand terms. Coal is much, much higher, especially in terms of rand terms. So it is a little bit all over the place with the different types of commodities, but we've assumed that it will continue for a little bit. I think that covers all of the revenue questions. Thank you.
Next.
Chris,
anybody else?
Sorry, Chair. Chris, just on the commodity boom, or maybe Boipuso will answer that between you and Boipuso.
Okay.
Sure, I'll take that. Thank you very much. Good morning, Honourable Chair and honourable members. We've been asked a couple of questions on the economic policy side, and maybe let me start with the commodity question, just because that's where Chris left off, and our acting DG has requested some clarity there. So honourable members and chair, you will recall at the time of the MTBPS last year, we had already started to indicate that our sense of it was that the commodity boom, or the rally in prices that we've seen, wouldn't be a permanent one, and that prices would start to fall off from the export commodity side. That was reflected in our view on the terms of trade, which we had initially anticipated to contract very sharply in 2022. Since then, and since the tabling of the budget, we then saw an escalation in geopolitical tension in Russia and Ukraine, which had implications on global value chains and subsequently global prices for commodities. This resulted in a second rally in our export commodity prices, but also in our input commodity prices, and subsequently had implications for our terms of trade. So while we have observed a contraction in the terms of trade in relation to what we've seen in previous years, it was not as strong as we initially anticipated, and subsequently you see that coming through in our numbers for the GDP deflator. So to be more clear, our sense of it is that export commodity prices are going to fall off from the highs that we've seen at the peak of the supply chain disruptions, and that import commodity prices are going to decrease. And this is also reflected in our current account position, where we have the current account as a percentage of GDP going back into contractionary territory as of next year. So hopefully that answers that. We also do provide quite an exhaustive list of the assumptions that we use on the commodity prices, both on the export and on the import side in table 2.3, which is on page 19, I think, of the MTBPS, just for any further clarification there. So I hopefully that answers that. The next question that we received was from the co-chair Masonganyi, when you asked about repo rates and sort of what they mean, and whether or not it's sustainable or appropriate in this environment to see an increase in repo rates. Now, our acting DG has spoken to the Reserve Bank's mandate and its independence, but from our perspective, when investigating the macroeconomic framework and what it means for economic activity, we're particularly concerned by, I suppose, a step 4, that the drivers that result in increasing repo rate, and that's primarily inflation. So we've seen globally and domestically sharp increases in inflation, and these price increases have largely been driven by non-core inflation, primarily through fuel and food prices. Now, this is particularly concerning, especially for emerging markets like ours, because these two drivers of costs tend to disproportionately affect low-income households because of just how much of their income is spent on these goods and services. And as a result, we're particularly concerned about what this means for the cost of living, and that's come out quite clearly in the conversation this morning. And we're also concerned about what this means for household incomes and balance sheets going forward. So what we're particularly concerned about is inflation and its impact on economic activity. And as a result, we are seeing changes in repo rates, not just domestically, but the world over, to contain inflation because of its implications on economic activity more generally. So hopefully that answers that second question. I'm happy to engage further if there are any follow-ups in that regard. I think that then is a useful segue to the question that Honorable Du Toit asked regarding our view on what happens in the global environment if we see further escalation in geopolitical tensions, and what we think that might mean for economic activity and subsequently revenues. So Chris spoke to this briefly, but to give a little bit more color, we have done this assessment and presented it in scenario B in chapter 2, where we look at what would happen if we saw slower growth globally, increasing prices through the inflation transmission mechanism, and what that might mean for global growth, but also more domestically, what that might mean for South African GDP outcomes, and we present that in scenario B. We also do that assessment in the context of the fiscal framework more broadly in Annexure A, which is the fiscal risk statement, which shows the net effect of those combined impacts on the fiscal balances, not just now, but also over the medium term. So we provide that analysis as well in the book. Just to provide some clarity on a question raised by the PBO, first I'll ask, because we were asked sort of two questions, one technical and one ideological. So let me start with the technical question. Just to clarify, the average that we presented in this, that Edgar presented in his slides on gross fixed capital formation was just illustrative to show what the medium-term outlook for gross fixed capital formation means in relation to growth. It was not to indicate that we forecast gross fixed capital formation using long-term averages. In fact, we have quite a robust forecasting process that includes quite a technically engaging assumptions process that takes into consideration the drivers of investment, of consumption, of the external environment. We then have a tool by way of a quarterly projections model that has been rebased, and we spoke to this in the MTBPS last year, but also has been recalibrated to ensure that it's fit for purpose. Just to clarify in that regard, so we do very much assess in a very technical way the different drivers of components of economic activity, including gross fixed capital formation, and that's what informs our view. Incidentally, also there have been assessments of the robustness of our forecasting tools generally and our forecasts more generally. And Generally, these external assessments seem to show that they are, for the most part, fit for purpose and not, and our forecast areas are not out of line, or sort of, or that don't suggest that the tools are somehow not fit for purpose, or that the forecasts are not as accurate as they should be, given the information that is at our disposal. I think the final question, I think, is an important one, is regarding possibly speaking past each other from an ideological perspective, from an economic growth perspective, and sort of what we think needs to be done. In our assessment, we think that engagement is important, and robust engagements on these critical areas are very important. We have been quite consistent in our view in this regard, and also been quite consistent in our messaging. We have published a growth paper in 2019 that gave a sense of our view of the structural impediments to growth and why they're so important to be addressed. That went out for public consultation, and those have been reflected and incorporated in updated versions of the document. We also publish quarterly reports on Operation Vulindlela, which have sort of media engagements as well, to ensure that we do have a robust engagement on these issues. Beyond that, I am happy to hear that the Parliamentary Budget Office is looking for us to have further engagements in this regard. We have always been open to them and would be keen to have these engagements, whether it be through workshops with technical experts who have different views on how we can approach economic or think about economic rationale. Similarly, if we can engage across institutions, that we perfectly fine as well. We are and always have been open to robust engagement. We think it's necessary and important, and we've always been clear in our views and are happy to justify and take that conversation forward in that regard. I think that covers all of the questions that we've been asked. If there's anything that I have omitted, please do let me know, Chair, and I'll happily come back to respond to those. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who's next? So,
is there anyone from ALM? ALM? Okay. No, Chair, let me come in. I think, as I said, just on we'll respond to the questions in writing, some of the more technical questions. I think certainly on the questions on the World Bank loan, I would have liked our ALM colleagues to talk to us, because, as I said, this particular loan is to Eskom directly, the way I understand it, but we will provide that info. It's not new information, so we have. I know the minister has raised the issue, if I recall, or just through some of the presentations that we've made. But let me come back to you on that. And as I said, this is the second loan that we've had from the World Bank. They call it something like a DPO loan. But yeah, let me provide that information, Chair, since the ALM people are not here. Chair, let me just end by saying, I think on the one hand, certainly this budget from a macro fiscal perspective, I think, means that we have a primary surplus next year. We actually do stabilize debt. And that means that, we can begin to rebuild the fiscal space that will enable us to fund the many, many demands that are out there. Of course, it's happening at a tough time with the world being so uncertain, and lots of shocks and impacts on households. Certainly on poor and middle class households, the impact is even bigger. And whilst the SRD grant might have been extended and some measures taken, it's clearly never going to be enough, because it's very hard to work against global trends or global forces when you're a small economy like South Africa. But it's something we obviously monitor, as we did like with the fuel levy. We announced when the prices reached a very high level, as you know, we announced the relief. But again, at some point, those costs do need to be absorbed because there's no way a fiscal can fight against such strong forces, I think. But yeah, let me stop there, Chair.
Okay, I see Dennis's hand. Is it up again, or is it a previous hand?
Yeah, Chair, just Mama's just triggered a question for me there, please, if I may ask, because he says that it seems as if this is an Eskom borrowing, Eskom direct borrowing. Now, with the shifting of debt, the debt swap that's been outlined in the MTBPS, surely Treasury has got some sort of control or management, or at least oversight to control what Eskom is allowed to borrow, certainly in the current framework. You know, if not, is that going to be part of the conditions that go along with the debt swap? I think that's quite an important point, because if Eskom's already in trouble and can't service their debt, but now we're allowing them to take more onto their balance sheet. I mean, I understand this is probably going to be at a much lower interest rate than most other lending because of the nature of what's to be funded, and I realize it's probably a bit of a sweetheart loan, but even so, there must be some sort of control. If we can just get a short answer on that, or perhaps a commitment to follow through, as he says, he's not sure of the nature of it. Perhaps he can just give us that detail when they do reply.
All right, Dennis, over to you, Momo.
Yes, Chair. Look, these are not unplanned loans. These are loans that have been discussed with the Treasury. In fact, the Treasury has had to guarantee this particular loan. So SOEs do tend to ideally borrow on their own balance sheet. Obviously, Eskom's had some challenges. So the debt relief that we're going to provide to Eskom will just enable them to go to the market within the framework that's agreed with assets and liability with the National Treasury. But yes, we will provide more detail when we respond. These numbers then do come up in the contingent liability. They're not necessarily part of the gross borrowing requirement when SOEs borrow. So yeah, we'll provide that info, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Unless there's another hand up, I'll just say a few quick things and then hand over to the chair, co-chair, to draw to a close. Before anything else, I think I should remind stakeholders, please, to submit your summaries so that the section that deals with what you think are the key points of what you're saying are carried by you, not by the committee. So, up to a page of the main points you would like covered in the report. Secondly, Momo, I like your term. I haven't heard it before, but maybe others have, that the SOCs are becoming like a fourth sphere of government entitled to the equitable share. I think it's a really interesting way of saying it. And then there'll be zombie SOCs. Okay. There is one thing before I hand over to the co-chair to draw to a close, and that's the, needless to say, the grey listing bill, as I call it, right? General Laws Amendment Bill. Now, we were hoping to, the committee would, on the NA side, finish the bill this week, take it to the House next week, and we set next Thursday aside to have public hearings. And the week after that, we're actually going to the province, okay, taking Parliament to the people. So we're in big trouble because from what we can gather, National Treasury said, no, you can't appear before the SCOF yesterday, and you've postponed it to next Thursday, not next Tuesday, next Thursday. Now remember, we still got the tax bills, and the same committees and appropriations, right? So we got all the appropriations bills and everything else to deal with. So, I will speak to the co-chair. We are very, very worried on the NCOP side, because looking at the number of submissions you got on the NA side, those people who don't get what they want will probably come to our side. And it's going to be quite torturous, really, because this is our, taking Parliament to the people. So I can't prescribe to you and the committee on the NA side. But can we please see if you can't bring your sittings forward? You can't have your cake and eat it. You bring us this bill at the last moment. Let's not go there now. We're tired of saying it. Although interestingly, I did raise with Mkile, who's a very good official, really, and he's not to be blamed, But I did raise with him and his team, look, you know what, this is very unfair, etc. Not knowing that Chairperson Naswangani had also said similar things. And then the following day, I read in the media what he had said, and he's spot on. Actually, one of the members of our chat group on the CCOF side said, you see, the committee chair is tougher than we are being on our side. I thought I was being quite tough. That's why I'm teasing my co-chair that he's no more as diplomatic as he sometimes is. We have different personalities, but, on that, we're on the same page. That, it's really, really unfair. And I was immensely pleased when the co-chair had said that too. He has the same strong views, but I mean, his style is obviously, you can't have two Joes and two Eunices. Oh, we've got two Eunices, but she's in civil society, mercifully, and I'm here. Right, so basically what we're saying, Momo, you know what, can't you do something, please? That committee is ready to process that bill. Because what we're going to end up with is we can't finish the bill, and then we're going to run into February, and then we finish the bill, and then people are going to say, you see the NCOP rush to court, and remember they won almost every, if Frank is here, every case, I think, where the NCOP was taken to court for not processing a bill that came to us at the NA, from the NA at the last minute. So you can't blame the Standing Committee on Finance. If it were the case, we could have discussed it privately, but it's not an issue. No, please, man, do something and sort it out, because there's no guarantee that even when you go there on Thursday next, that you're going to be able to vote on that bill. So can we plead with you, Momo? Please, 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 sort this matter out with the committee chair and the committee on that side. Having said that, Momo, do you want to say anything in response to that? This grey listing thing is really worrying us on our side. Bo.
No, Chair. I think, look, you're right, and we understand the urgency. To be, I know the team has been working flat out.
No, we appreciate all that. Yeah.
And we asked the co-chair just to, give us another week, because, we understand it's been really not very fair to honorable members when documentation comes late, but the processes of consultation have been ongoing. So, Chair, we will do that. I'm hopeful that next week we've submitted the documents yesterday to the SCOF, and hopefully the SCOF will be able to consider that. That's up to SCOF. Chair, I just wanted to say, I see Ravesh is here from ALM. He can come in quickly on the TPO if you want him to come.
Oh, fine. Okay. Yeah. Okay. It's 11:37. Yeah, it's fine. Go ahead.
Ravesh, you want to just come in?
A quick brief reply. Yeah. No, not so brief, because I think it's quite an important issue. Just answer the co-chair and the committee on that.
Hi, Chair. My name is Ravesh from ALM. I'm not actually responding to the DPO one, but I think just in relation to the ESCOM, borrowings, because in terms of the conditions, we will be attaching conditions relating to the ESCOM borrowings, that it should be restricted for maintenance capex and for critical infrastructure. So I think just to the question that was posed by the Honourable Rider, in terms of the DPO, we will respond in writing from our colleagues who deal with this from the Liability Management Division. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know whether the co-chair is satisfied, but in any case, he's coming in now to draw the meeting to a close, and I hand over to him. Thank you.
Should I come in, Comrade?
Yeah, Comrade, I'm done.
Okay, thanks very much. I got cut off because of load shedding here, which will take another 2 or 3 hours to be sorted out. This thing of load shedding is a problem. And I missed out on what was the response by the acting DDG on the issue of the statement that I referred to coming from the World Bank on the loan on just transition and other related matters. But be that as it may, we work as a collective. I hope he responded adequately, because I'm very worried that we were dealing with the debt here. And now we're told the ESCOM can go to markets and go to World Bank and borrow money. The next thing, it has to be bailed out. Where are the results of all this money that is being borrowed? If an SOE is borrowing money, but at the end of the year comes to Treasury for bailout, we see power stations are burning. There is a power station now that is being decommissioned in Mpumalanga. What is the impact in that regard? Are we going to survive on borrowings until when? And are we not going to have our country being taken over by World Bank and IMF one day? And we as public representatives just stay at home and somebody runs a country for us. We must ask these questions because we have seen that happening in other countries. And we must be very worried as responsible public representatives. I think, Chair, a space has to be created where we have enough time with PBO, FFC, and other stakeholders to discuss the issue of our economic trajectory. Because when we went to FFC in April, they were worried that it's like as a constitutional structure, we as Parliament and National Treasury, we don't take much of their recommendations. Remember, FFC, unlike other structures, derives its existence from the Constitution. So whatever they say, it must be taken very, very, very serious. And I think at some stage, probably next year, because now the program for the fourth term is out, we have to meet them. The same applies with PBO. It's a very important organ of Parliament. These structures were established for a particular purpose, and we must live up to what they were established for. So we might need to create space to have them coming back where we deal with this issue of our economic trajectory and have the same understanding coming out of that meeting. Because you can see we're talking past each other, and we live here under the impression that we agree. We are not agreeing, even with the same government entities that are here to support Parliament are not agreeing with the position that Treasury is taking. At some stage, the president presented the economic reconstruction and recovery plan. What's happening to that plan? Is it still there? If it's there, who's monitoring it? What direction? It's not recovering. It has got very, very serious challenges. Unemployment is going up. Youth unemployment is a problem. And what do? More and more people are going to bed hungry. We can't be people who are public representatives in Parliament leading people who are hungry. Surely we have to do something about this thing. As you have raised the issue of BIG, comrade units, it's a matter that we have to discuss. How do we cushion the poor when they are facing all these challenges? And because it's a problem. Unemployment, hunger, poverty, inequality are all going up. And we're here, we are dealing with a very crucial matter called a budget. How is it addressing these issues? Is this budget pro-poor? If it is pro-poor, why is unemployment going up? Why are we having more and more people from 1994? By now, we're supposed to be defeating poverty and hunger like what China and other countries have done. But instead, we see more people becoming hungry under our watch. It can't be. It's a matter that we have to discuss. In February, when it comes to the issue of energy, in February, Minister Gotongwana said that he's going to have a bilateral with the Minister of Minerals and Energy to deal with the ever-escalating fuel price. I'm not sure how far he is. This thing is a problem. I'm not sure whether you have been to supermarkets of late. You find people are struggling with the little money that they have to buy food items there. And basics, not luxury stuff like ice cream and sweets and other things. Basics, tomatoes, meat and stuff like that. Because of this problem, because the price of petrol is going up, transport is going up, everything is going up. We understand the problem of Ukraine and Russia, which doesn't seem it will be resolved so soon. But what do we do ourselves as government to deal with this matter? So Minister Godongwana will have to come back to us and say, the meeting that I have had with Minister Mantashe, this is what we have discussed, and these are the decisions that we have taken to deal with this matter. It's a very serious matter. The poor now are finding it very difficult even to afford money for transport to go to work. So they will reach a stage where it will be difficult even to go to work because the railway system has got so many challenges. And I hope it is being attended to, as the minister has actually alluded to that. I think it was the president at some stage who said that the issue of fertilizers will be attended to. And there is an entity in Palabura in Limpopo, I think it's called Fiscal, if I'm not mistaken, that it is going to be capacitated so that it can be able to close the gap that is caused by the supply of fertilizers from Ukraine and Russia. How far are we in getting Fiscal to be recapacitated to deal with issues that farmers are raising? Because if farmers are raising very critical issues of fertilizers, we are going to have a problem of food insecurity not so long. And that is going to create a serious problem for the country. So we have to get the reports on some of these things, because sometimes you find we get lots of commitments from government through SONA, MTBPS and February budget, and we don't make follow-up. Probably what I have to request, let's get the research team in our committees here to look at all the commitments that the president and the ministers have made in regard to fiscal framework. And we follow up and get responses from government as to how do we deal with this matter. Lastly, Chairperson, the issue of the General Laws Amendment Bill, we had a very serious problem last week, Tuesday. Because last week when we met, we agreed that Treasury is going to submit its responses to a SCOF support team on Monday. We did not receive the responses by Monday until when we have to go to the meeting at 6 o'clock in the evening. We ended up starting that meeting at 7. At that meeting, the support team, Dr. Zakele, tells us that he has just received responses from Treasury. Members went to the meeting without a copy of the report. That is an ambush. How were they going to discuss in that meeting? Because they are members of political parties. They must get mandate from their political parties and come there with a clear stance that this is the position of my political party. So we said we can't proceed because we don't have a report that members have seen before. And we also questioned the issue of SEAS as to where is the SEAS report, because we don't have it. Then the following day, we got a certificate from presidency to say that Treasury has been exempted, but we don't see the reasons in that certificate. Why is Treasury exempted from conducting SEAS? So I wrote the letter back to the minister to say, give us the reasons. We can't just take the certificate as it is to say Treasury has got an exemption. Based on what? Because SEAS is a compliance requirement. It's not a by the way issue. So we are still waiting for those reasons from the minister. to tell us why did he apply for exemption and why was that exemption granted? And taking this law forward, what will be the implication if we don't have a CS report? It is our responsibility as public representatives to make sure that whatever we do when we pass legislations, it complies. It's not a matter of ticking the box and take things as they are, because we'll be blamed later that what did that as parliament you did. So it was against that background, the chairperson. It was not just that we didn't want to pass the report. The report was not there. It just came straight with the Dr. Zakel right at the meeting. And you can't blame him. If the whole Monday he doesn't get anything, what was he going to do? So that's where we are as we speak. Above that, remember this General Laws Amendment Bill has got consequential impact on amending other 5 legislations. And out of those 5 legislations, I think it's only one legislation that is falling under the competency of SCOF. The other legislations are from social development, DTI, and Companies Act, and others. What does it mean if SCOF, through amending what we call a General Laws Amendment Bill, also amend bills that belong to other committees? And at the end, we don't want to be seen like we are a super committee called SCOF. It's going to create problems with our colleagues in Parliament. That, okay, you sit there and amend bills without our involvement. We understand the issue of grey listing, but grey listing should not make us to do things that is going to create problems tomorrow with Parliament. So we have to clarify all these issues to make sure that at the end, whatever bill that we pass, it complies. Because if it doesn't, somebody is going to challenge it and the Constitutional Court kicks out, and then we are back to a situation where we are. And there's nobody who has got an interest to see the country grey listed. Because with the situation where we find ourselves in now, if the country gets grey listed, it's going to worsen. We're going to be in a worse off situation than where we are now. All of us, Parliament and the public in general, will want to see South Africa not grey listed. But in whatever we do, we want to do things properly. We have dealt with the regulations before of FIC. Now we're dealing with the law, but the bill must be make sure that it complies. So you should understand, Chairperson, we would have liked that by Tuesday, this week, the bill should, the report should have been adopted so that the matter comes to you. But if Treasury doesn't supply us with the relevant information, there's no way as Parliament we can just meet and just tick the box and say the bill must just go through with even if it does not comply. So that was the background against which we had to deal with that matter. And I think if they said they have submitted the report now to SCOF, which we are going to go through it complies with all the issues that we have gone through, then we'll adopt the report and take it to the NA. Then it gets referred to yourselves as the NCOP. Thanks very much, Chairperson and colleagues.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. There's nothing further for me to say. Obviously, the plea was directed to Treasury. We understand that SCOF, as I said, it's beyond its control. You're doing what you have to do, and rightly so. And we appreciate that. All right. I mean, the chairperson has closed the meeting, really. I just came in to say I'm hoping that NCOP members have got a better insight now into what's happened. So then thank you very much, everybody. The chairperson already covered what he wanted to say, and there's nothing further for me to say except to acknowledge that Treasury has to please help SCOF and help us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks.
Recording stopped.